The children stopped screaming after the third day. That's when the neighbors knew something had changed in the yellow house on the corner. Some monsters are born in darkness, but Juan Catalino Dominguez built his in broad daylight, one victim at a time, while an entire community looked away. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker. Tonight, we dive into 4 true crimes, each more gripping than the last. If you enjoy them, a like, comment, or subscribe helps keep the truth alive. Now, this is the story of the predator who wore a badge. We hunt predators in the night, believing evil wears a recognizable face. But what happens when the monster doesn't hide in shadows? When he walks among us in uniform, smiling, trusted, untouchable? Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of Juan Catalino Dominguez, a man who didn't just cross the line between human and monster. He erased it entirely, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives that would make even the coldest hearts stop beating. This is the story of how one man turned a Mexican town into his personal hunting ground, and how the screams of the innocent echoed for decades before anyone dared to listen. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. San Luis de la Paz looked like every other dusty town in the Guanajuato highlands. Humble homes with peeling paint, streets where children played soccer until darkness fell, and faces worn by honest labor under the relentless Mexican sun. The year was 1959, and life moved slowly here, predictably, safely. Or so everyone believed. Juan Catalino Dominguez wasn't born a monster, but somewhere along the twisted corridors of his mind, something fundamental had broken, splintered into pieces that could never be reassembled into anything resembling human. He stood just over 5 feet 8 inches tall, unremarkable in every physical way, average build, forgettable features, the kind of face that dissolved into a crowd. But those who looked closely, really looked, might have noticed something swimming behind his eyes, something ancient and hungry that had no place in a man's soul. He worked odd jobs, drifting from one employer to another with the ease of someone who understood how to blend in, how to become invisible when necessary. But invisibility wasn't enough for Dominguez. He craved something more intoxicating than mere anonymity. He wanted power, real power, the kind that would let him operate in plain sight while the world remained blind to his true nature. That's when he discovered the perfect camouflage: authority. Dominguez didn't become a police officer through noble intentions or a desire to serve his community. He infiltrated law enforcement the way a virus infiltrates a healthy body. Slowly, deliberately, mimicking normalcy until it's too late to stop the infection. The uniform gave him something more valuable than weapons or legal immunity. It gave him trust. Parents taught their children that police officers were heroes, protectors, safe harbors in a dangerous world. What those parents couldn't fathom, what their minds couldn't process even when the evidence screamed at them, was that some predators wear badges. San Luis de la Paz in the late 1950s was a community bound by unspoken rules and deep-rooted traditions. Families had lived there for generations, their histories intertwined like the roots of ancient trees. Everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. The concept of a serial predator, especially one operating under the protection of a police uniform, existed beyond the boundaries of their collective imagination. Evil, they believed, came from outside, from strangers, from cities, from places where moral order had collapsed. Evil couldn't possibly be homegrown, couldn't possibly wear the face of someone they greeted at church or seen directing traffic on Sunday mornings. But Dominguez understood something profound about human nature. People see what they want to see, and they'll perform remarkable mental gymnastics to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. He studied his community like a predator studying prey, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their blind spots. He discovered that the poorest families, those living on the ragged edges of society, made the perfect targets. Their children played in streets far from watchful eyes. Their parents worked impossible hours just to survive. And when something went wrong, when a child disappeared or came home with bruises, these families had no voice, no power, no means to demand justice. The first victim, though we'll never know if she truly was the first, was a girl of 11 whose name has been lost to history, buried alongside her testimony in files that mysteriously disappeared from police archives. She lived in one of the poorest neighborhoods, a place where houses crowded together like frightened animals, where sewage ran openly in ditches, and where hope was a luxury no one could afford. Her mother worked 12-hour days at a textile factory. Her father had abandoned the family years earlier, and she had 3 younger siblings who depended on her for care. Dominguez approached her on a sweltering afternoon in August, his police uniform crisp despite the heat, his smile practiced and predatory. He told her he needed help, that there was an emergency, that her mother had been injured at the factory, and she needed to come with him immediately. The girl's heart hammered in her chest, not from fear of the officer, but from terror for her mother. She climbed into his vehicle without hesitation, without question, because everything in her young life had taught her that police officers were trustworthy, that uniforms meant safety. What happened in the hours that followed would establish a pattern that Dominguez would repeat with variations over the coming years, a ritual of torture and violation that fed something dark and insatiable within him. He drove her far from town, to an isolated area where the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, where her screams would be swallowed by wind and distance. There, he showed her what he really was, what had been lurking behind that uniform and that practiced smile all along. The horror inflicted upon that child, and the many who would follow, defies comfortable description. Dominguez didn't simply assault his victims. He seemed to feed on their terror, to draw sustenance from their suffering. He would keep them for hours, sometimes days, carefully calibrating their pain, ensuring they remained conscious and aware of every violation, every degradation. He wanted them to know exactly what was happening, wanted their minds to fracture under the weight of trauma that no child should ever bear. When he finally released them, broken and barely alive, he would issue a warning that carried the full weight of his authority. Tell anyone, and worse would follow. Tell anyone, and he would return for their siblings. Tell anyone, and their families would suffer consequences beyond imagination. Most devastating of all, he knew that even if they did tell, who would believe them? He was a police officer. They were children from the poorest families, families without influence, without education, without any social capital to spend on accusations against a representative of law and order. The girl stumbled home long after dark, her body violated, her mind shattered, her spirit crushed under the weight of what had been done to her. Her mother took one look at her daughter and knew immediately that something catastrophic had occurred. But when the girl finally managed to choke out her story, when she described the police officer who had destroyed her childhood in a single afternoon, her mother faced an impossible choice: report the crime and risk everything, or remain silent and pray it never happened again. She chose silence, not out of cowardice, but out of a brutal calculus that the poor understand instinctively. The system wasn't built to protect people like them, and challenging it would bring only more suffering. So the girl's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, her torn clothes were burned, and the family collectively agreed to carry this secret like a weight that would slowly crush them from within. Dominguez watched from a distance, observing the family, waiting to see if they would report him. When days passed and no complaint materialized, when he heard no whispers of accusations, he felt something that others might call relief, but that he experienced as validation. He had been right about everything, about the power differential, about the silence that poverty enforces, about the shield his uniform provided. The realization was intoxicating, addictive, liberating. If he could do it once and face no consequences, he could do it again, and again, and again. The monster had tested the boundaries of his hunting ground and found them infinitely expansive. San Luis de la Paz had become his personal preserve, stocked with victims who had no defense against him, no recourse, no hope. The yellow house on the corner of Calle Morelos, where Dominguez lived alone, would become a chamber of horrors that the community would later struggle to accept had existed in their midst for years. As that first victim tried desperately to return to some semblance of normal life, as she struggled through nightmares and flashbacks and a profound sense of contamination that would never fully leave her, Dominguez was already selecting his next target. The hunt had begun, and it would continue for years, leaving a trail of destroyed lives that would eventually number in the dozens, perhaps hundreds. The true count may never be known. The predator had found his paradise, and he wore a badge that made him untouchable. Over the following years, a pattern emerged that would have been obvious to anyone looking for it. But no one was looking because no one wanted to believe such evil could flourish in their community. Children began disappearing with alarming frequency, particularly from the poorest neighborhoods where Dominguez had learned to hunt with impunity. Some returned after hours or days, traumatized and broken, their stories dismissed as fantasies or lies. Others simply vanished, swallowed by whatever dark places the monster took them, their families left to wonder and grieve without ever knowing the truth. Dominguez refined his methods with each victim, developing techniques that maximized his control while minimizing his risk. He learned which neighborhoods had the least surveillance, which times of day offered the most opportunities, which types of children were most vulnerable to his approaches. He varied his tactics, sometimes posing as a helpful officer offering rides home, other times claiming to investigate crimes and needing children to answer questions, occasionally simply using his authority to order children to accompany him. The uniform was his skeleton key, opening doors that should have remained locked, granting him access to victims who should have been protected. Parents taught their children to trust police officers, to obey their instructions, to see them as heroes and guardians. Dominguez weaponized that trust with surgical precision, turning society's protective instincts against itself. One victim, a boy of 9 named Roberto, was approached while playing near the town market. Dominguez told him that his father had been arrested for public drunkenness and needed bail money. The boy, terrified for his father, followed the officer willingly. What happened over the next 6 hours would destroy the boy's childhood and fundamentally alter the trajectory of his entire life. When Roberto finally made it home, barely able to walk, his father took one look at his son's condition and knew exactly what kind of monster they were dealing with. But Roberto's father faced the same impossible choice that so many others had confronted: report the crime and risk retribution against his family, or remain silent and protect what little security they had. He chose silence, but the decision poisoned him from within. He began drinking more heavily, his marriage collapsed under the strain of the secret, and Roberto grew into adolescence carrying trauma that manifested in violent outbursts and an inability to form healthy relationships. The ripples of Dominguez's crimes extended far beyond the immediate violations, shattering families and destroying futures. The yellow house on Calle Morelos became an epicenter of evil that operated in plain sight. Neighbors would later report hearing strange sounds, crying, screaming, banging, but they dismissed these noises as products of their imagination or explained them away with convenient rationalizations. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Senora Martinez, once saw Dominguez dragging a small child into his house in the middle of the afternoon. The child appeared to be resisting, crying, clearly terrified. Senora Martinez watched from her window, her heart pounding, but she convinced herself that she must have misunderstood what she was seeing. He was a police officer, after all. He must have been helping the child with something, must have had a good reason for whatever she'd witnessed. This collective willingness to look away, to rationalize, to deny what was happening in their midst, became Dominguez's greatest ally. The community essentially granted him permission to operate by refusing to confront the mounting evidence that something was profoundly wrong. Every parent who dismissed their child's story, every neighbor who turned away from suspicious activities, every official who failed to investigate the pattern of disappearances and assaults, they all became unwitting accomplices to his crimes. By the early 1960s, Dominguez had become bolder, more confident, increasingly reckless in his predation. He began keeping victims for longer periods, sometimes days at a time, in the yellow house that had become his torture chamber. He soundproofed certain rooms, created hiding places where he could conceal children when visitors came by, developed elaborate systems for maintaining control over multiple victims simultaneously. The house itself became an extension of his pathology, each room reflecting a different facet of his depravity. One victim, a girl of 13 named Elena, managed to escape after being held captive for 3 days. She fled into the street screaming, her body covered in bruises and burns, her mind fractured by trauma. Several neighbors witnessed her escape, saw her pointing back at Dominguez's house, heard her desperate accusations. For a brief moment, it seemed that the community's willful blindness might finally shatter, that the truth could no longer be denied or rationalized away. But Dominguez moved quickly to control the narrative. He claimed that Elena was a disturbed girl who had broken into his home and injured herself during a psychotic episode. He produced a report, falsified, but stamped with official seals, indicating that Elena had a history of mental illness and self-harm. He positioned himself as the victim, as a dedicated officer who had tried to help a troubled child and was now being unfairly accused. The community, desperate for any explanation that didn't force them to confront the monster in their midst, accepted his version of events with disturbing eagerness. Elena was institutionalized, labeled as mentally ill, her testimony dismissed as delusions. She would spend the rest of her short life in and out of psychiatric facilities, dying by suicide at age 22. Another victim whose death certificate would never list Dominguez's name but who was killed by him nonetheless, just more slowly, more completely, her entire existence erased by the trauma he had inflicted. The monster's confidence reached its apex during this period. He began to believe he was truly untouchable, that he could operate with complete impunity indefinitely. He started taking trophies from his victims, small items of clothing, photographs, locks of hair, which he kept in a hidden room in his house, arranged like artifacts in a museum of horror. He would revisit these trophies regularly, using them to relive his crimes, to maintain the high that came from absolute power over helpless victims. But monsters, no matter how careful, eventually make mistakes. Dominguez's error came in the form of a victim who refused to be silenced, whose family had connections he hadn't accounted for, whose story would finally penetrate the wall of denial that had protected him for so long. Her name was Carmen, and she was the daughter of a mid-level government official from a neighboring town. She had been visiting relatives in San Luis de la Paz when Dominguez spotted her playing near the plaza. He followed his usual pattern, approaching in uniform, claiming there was an emergency, using his authority to compel compliance. But Carmen's abduction and assault would prove to be the beginning of the end for the monster who had terrorized an entire community for years. Her father, unlike the poor families Dominguez had victimized previously, had resources, connections, and the social capital to demand a real investigation. When Carmen was found 12 hours after her abduction, barely alive and severely traumatized, her father immediately bypassed local authorities and contacted state police investigators. For the first time, Dominguez faced scrutiny from officials who weren't his colleagues, who didn't share his institutional loyalty, who weren't invested in protecting the reputation of the local police force. The investigation began slowly, cautiously, but as detectives started interviewing community members and reviewing records, a horrifying pattern emerged. Dozens of families, when promised protection and anonymity, came forward with stories of children victimized by a police officer matching Dominguez's description. Years of suffering, years of silence, years of trauma, all suddenly spilling out in a torrent of testimony that could no longer be ignored or explained away. The yellow house on Calle Morelos was finally searched in March 1963, and what investigators found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The hidden room with its trophies, the soundproof chambers, the tools of torture, the photographs documenting years of abuse, the evidence of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of victims. Evidence that Dominguez had been so confident would never be discovered that he had meticulously documented his own crimes. The community of San Luis de la Paz was forced to confront a terrible truth. They had allowed this to happen. Through their silence, their denial, their willingness to rationalize the evidence before their eyes, they had enabled a predator to operate freely for years. The children who had tried to tell the truth, the families who had reported suspicious activities, the victims who had pointed fingers at a uniformed officer. They had all been right, and the community had abandoned them to protect their comfortable illusions about safety and order. Juan Catalino Dominguez's arrest in March 1963 sent shockwaves through Guanajuato and beyond. The case quickly became national news, forcing Mexico to confront uncomfortable questions about police corruption, institutional failures, and the vulnerability of children in communities where authority figures operated without meaningful oversight. But the path from arrest to justice would prove almost as traumatic as the crimes themselves, revealing how deeply the rot had spread through the systems designed to protect the innocent. The initial investigation faced immediate obstacles. Evidence had mysteriously disappeared from police archives. Reports filed by families years earlier, witness statements, incident logs that would have documented the pattern of crimes. Dominguez's colleagues in the local police force, desperate to distance themselves from his atrocities and protect their own careers, claimed they had never suspected anything, never received complaints, never had reason to question his conduct. Their collective amnesia was as transparent as it was infuriating, but proving they had actively covered for him would require evidence they had spent years destroying. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a stern man named Licenciado Ramirez, quickly realized he was dealing with something unprecedented in Mexican legal history. Serial sexual predators who targeted children existed, certainly, but one who had operated so brazenly for so long, protected by a uniform and a wall of institutional complicity. This was new territory. Ramirez knew that he needed to build an ironclad case, because Dominguez's defense team was already constructing an elaborate strategy to create reasonable doubt and paint their client as the victim of a conspiracy. Interviewing the victims became a process of excavating buried trauma, forcing people who had spent years trying to forget the worst moments of their lives to relive them in excruciating detail. Many of the now adult victims had built fragile lives on foundations of denial and compartmentalization. Being asked to testify meant potentially destroying those carefully constructed defenses. Some refused outright, unable to face the prospect of public testimony. Others agreed but fell apart during interviews, their trauma too raw, too overwhelming to articulate in ways the legal system required. One victim, a young woman named Maria who had been assaulted by Dominguez at age 10, agreed to testify despite the personal cost. She had spent the intervening years battling depression, addiction, and relationships destroyed by her inability to trust or feel safe. Now 21 years old, she sat across from Prosecutor Ramirez and methodically described everything Dominguez had done to her. Her voice flat, her eyes focused on some distant point beyond the walls of the office. She detailed his methods, his words, the way he had threatened her family, the years she had remained silent because she believed no one would believe a poor child over a police officer. Her testimony was devastating, precise, impossible to dismiss. But she was just one victim among dozens who would need to testify to capture the full scope of Dominguez's crimes. Ramirez began the painstaking process of building a comprehensive case, documenting each assault, each kidnapping, each moment of torture inflicted by the monster who had hidden behind a badge for so long. The physical evidence recovered from the Yellow House proved crucial. The trophies Dominguez had kept, items of clothing, photographs, personal effects, could be matched to specific victims. Forensic analysis of the soundproofed rooms revealed biological evidence connecting Dominguez to numerous crimes. The photographs were particularly damning, showing children in various stages of trauma, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that no jury could look at without understanding exactly what kind of predator they were confronting. But Dominguez's defense team, led by a lawyer named Jorge Villalobos who specialized in defending the indefensible, launched a multi-pronged attack on the prosecution's case. They challenged the legality of the search that had uncovered the evidence, claiming it had been conducted without proper warrants. They attacked the credibility of victims, suggesting their testimonies had been coached or invented. They presented Dominguez as a dedicated officer who had been framed by criminals seeking revenge for his zealous law enforcement activities. They even brought in psychiatric experts who testified that the accusations against their client were so extreme, so horrific, that they couldn't possibly be true. Surely this was mass hysteria, a modern-day witch hunt fueled by moral panic. The trial began in August 1963, held in a Guanajuato courthouse that couldn't accommodate the crowds demanding entry. Journalists from across Mexico packed the courtroom, their reports dominating newspaper front pages and radio broadcasts. The public was simultaneously horrified by the evidence and captivated by the spectacle of a former police officer being held accountable for crimes that challenged their understanding of human depravity. Victim after victim took the stand, their testimonies forming a cumulative portrait of sustained predation that spanned years. Some testified from behind screens, their identities protected, their voices barely above whispers as they recounted the worst moments of their lives. Others faced Dominguez directly, looking into the eyes of the man who had destroyed their childhoods, determined that he would see the human cost of his actions. A few broke down completely, unable to continue, their silence more powerful than any words could have been. Dominguez showed no emotion during most of the trial. He sat at the defense table in civilian clothes, his face a mask of indifference, occasionally whispering to his lawyers but never showing the slightest hint of remorse or shame. This emotional flatness, this apparent inability to connect with the suffering he had caused, made him even more monstrous in the eyes of observers. He wasn't a man who had made terrible mistakes. He was something fundamentally broken, something that had never possessed the capacity for empathy or conscience that defines humanity. The prosecution's case built momentum as expert after expert testified about the evidence recovered from the Yellow House. Forensic specialists explained how biological samples connected Dominguez to specific victims. Psychologists described the profound and lasting trauma inflicted on children subjected to sustained sexual violence. Police investigators from the state force described the patterns they had uncovered, the evidence of dozens of crimes spanning years, the systematic nature of Dominguez's predation. The defense fought back with everything in their arsenal, but their strategies became increasingly desperate as the weight of evidence mounted. Villalobos attacked individual testimonies, pointing to minor inconsistencies or memory gaps that he claimed invalidated entire accounts. He argued that the physical evidence had been contaminated or planted. He suggested that Dominguez was being scapegoated for broader failures in the community's child protection systems. Nothing worked. The jury could see through every manipulation, every attempt to redirect blame, every effort to cast doubt on the fundamentally clear truth. Juan Catalino Dominguez was guilty of crimes against dozens of children, and he had done it with calculation, malice, and a complete absence of human conscience. The verdict came in late October 1963, after 3 days of jury deliberations. Guilty on all counts, multiple charges of rape, kidnapping, assault, and torture of minors. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, grief, and rage as the verdict was read. Families of victims wept openly, some in satisfaction that justice had finally been served, others in anguish that no verdict could undo the damage inflicted on their children. Dominguez remained emotionless, his face betraying nothing, even as he was sentenced to multiple concurrent life sentences, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. But even as justice was finally served, difficult questions lingered. How had this been allowed to happen? How many officials had looked the other way, buried reports, dismissed victims' accounts? How deeply had the corruption spread through the local police force? And most disturbing of all, how many other predators were operating with similar impunity in communities across Mexico, protected by uniforms and authority, feeding on vulnerable victims who had no voice and no recourse? The trial of Juan Catalino Dominguez became a watershed moment in Mexican legal history, forcing conversations about institutional accountability, police oversight, and the protection of children from those entrusted with authority. But for the victims whose testimonies had finally brought the monster to justice, the verdict was bittersweet. A necessary step, certainly, but one that could never restore what had been taken from them. The Yellow House on Calle Morelos stood empty for months after Dominguez's conviction, a physical monument to evil that the community didn't know how to address. Some argued it should be burned to the ground, erased from existence as if destroying the building could somehow undo the atrocities committed within its walls. Others insisted it should be preserved as a reminder, a warning about what happens when communities fail to protect their most vulnerable members. Eventually, the local government seized the property and demolished it, but the empty lot that remained became a different kind of monument, a space haunted by memories that no amount of concrete or new construction could ever fully bury. For the victims, Dominguez's imprisonment marked not an ending but the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Trauma doesn't disappear because justice is served. It reshapes itself, manifesting in new and unexpected ways throughout a survivor's lifetime. Many of those who testified found themselves dealing with severe post-traumatic stress, experiencing flashbacks and nightmares that intensified after the trial forced them to confront buried memories. The public nature of the proceedings, while necessary for justice, also meant their most intimate violations became matters of public record, discussed in newspapers and whispered about in communities where anonymity was impossible. Maria, who had been one of the strongest witnesses during the trial, found herself unable to maintain the composure she had displayed in court once the proceedings ended. She spiraled into depression, attempted suicide twice, and spent years cycling through treatment facilities that understood trauma intellectually but couldn't provide the specialized care that victims of sustained childhood sexual violence required. Her family, well-meaning but ill-equipped to support her, watched helplessly as she struggled to rebuild a life on a foundation shattered beyond repair. Roberto, the boy who had been violated at age 9, had grown into an angry young man whose trauma manifested as violence toward others. He spent time in juvenile detention for assault, struggled with substance abuse, and found himself unable to form meaningful relationships with anyone. The rage that consumed him was really directed at Dominguez, at the community that had failed to protect him, at the universe that allowed such injustice, but it expressed itself in destructive patterns that perpetuated his suffering and isolated him further from any possibility of healing. Some victims found paths to recovery through advocacy and activism. A group of adult survivors formed an organization dedicated to supporting other victims of sexual violence and pushing for legal reforms that would make it harder for predators to operate with impunity. They lobbied for mandatory reporting requirements for child abuse, for better training of police officers in trauma-informed investigation techniques, for victim compensation funds, for specialized treatment programs. Their activism transformed their trauma into purpose, channeling their suffering toward preventing others from experiencing similar violations. But healing remained elusive for many. The psychological wounds inflicted by sustained sexual violence in childhood ripple outward through every aspect of a survivor's life: relationships, career choices, parenting decisions, basic abilities to trust and feel safe in the world. Some victims thrived despite their trauma, building successful lives through sheer force of will and determination. Others barely survived, existing on the margins of society, their potential squandered by damage inflicted before they were old enough to defend themselves. Still others didn't survive at all: suicides, overdoses, deaths that could be traced directly back to the trauma Dominguez had inflicted years or decades earlier. The community of San Luis de la Paz struggled with its own collective trauma and guilt. Once Dominguez's crimes became public, residents were forced to confront their complicity in his predation. How many warning signs had they ignored? How many times had they dismissed a child's story or rationalized suspicious behavior? How many victims might have been spared if someone, anyone, had found the courage to confront the evidence before their eyes? Some families who had lost children to disappearances years earlier now had to grapple with the probability that Dominguez had been responsible. Bodies were never recovered, definitive connections never established, but the circumstances and patterns pointed clearly to the monster who had hunted in their community for so long. These families existed in a state of ambiguous loss, unable to achieve closure, unable to properly grieve, suspended in a nightmare that Dominguez's imprisonment couldn't resolve. The local police force underwent a painful reformation process. State investigators rooted out corruption, forced retirements, filed charges against officers who had demonstrably covered for Dominguez or destroyed evidence. The department was essentially rebuilt from scratch with new leadership, new protocols, new commitments to transparency and accountability. But rebuilding trust with the community proved infinitely harder than restructuring the organization. Parents no longer taught their children that police officers were automatically trustworthy. That lesson had been bought with too much suffering. Dominguez himself spent his remaining years in Puente Grande Federal Prison, showing no signs of remorse or recognition of the suffering he had caused. Guards reported that he remained emotionally flat, disconnected from the magnitude of his crimes, occasionally complaining about minor inconveniences in his cell, but never expressing regret for the lives he had destroyed. He gave a handful of interviews to psychologists studying criminal pathology, during which he discussed his crimes with clinical detachment, as if describing things that had happened to someone else or that he had observed from a distance. In one particularly chilling interview conducted in 1971, Dominguez was asked if he felt any remorse for his victims. He paused, seemed to genuinely consider the question, then replied, "I don't think about them. They were opportunities that presented themselves, and I took advantage. I feel no more guilt about that than a butcher feels about cattle." The interviewer, a seasoned criminal psychologist who had worked with dozens of violent offenders, later said that Dominguez was among the most profoundly disconnected from basic humanity of anyone he had encountered. A man whose internal landscape lacked the fundamental emotional architecture that makes us human. Juan Catalino Dominguez died in prison in 1976, at age 53, from complications related to liver disease. His death was not widely reported, warranting only brief mentions in a few newspapers. None of his victims attended his burial. Most learned of his death months or years afterward, if they learned of it at all. Some felt a sense of relief that the monster could no longer breathe the same air they did. Others felt cheated, believing he had escaped true justice by dying relatively young and avoiding decades more of imprisonment. A few felt nothing at all, their capacity for emotional response to anything related to Dominguez having been exhausted years earlier. But his legacy of trauma continued to spread through generations. Victims who had become parents found themselves overprotective, unable to let their children out of sight, transmitting their own unresolved trauma as anxiety and fear. Some had avoided having children entirely, terrified of bringing new life into a world where monsters could wear uniforms and communities could collectively fail so profoundly. The ripple effects of his crimes touched grandchildren who never knew why their grandparents carried such visible sadness, great-grandchildren who grew up in families shaped by trauma they could never fully understand. The case of Juan Catalino Dominguez became a touchstone in discussions of institutional failure, police corruption, and the vulnerability of children in marginalized communities. Law enforcement agencies studied it as an example of how predators exploit positions of trust and how institutional loyalty can enable catastrophic evil. Child protection advocates referenced it when arguing for stronger oversight of authority figures who work with vulnerable populations. Trauma specialists cited it when explaining how sustained abuse in childhood creates wounds that persist across lifetimes. San Luis de la Paz slowly rebuilt itself in the decades after Dominguez's conviction, but the town was forever changed by the knowledge of what had been allowed to happen there. The community developed a fierce protectiveness toward children, perhaps overcompensating for its earlier failures. Parents organized neighborhood watch programs, schools implemented stringent protocols for background checks and supervision, and a culture of vigilance replaced the previous atmosphere of complacent trust. Today, more than 60 years after Dominguez's arrest, survivors of his crimes are elderly or deceased, their stories fading into history. But their suffering deserves to be remembered, not as lurid entertainment, but as a cautionary tale about the consequences of collective denial, institutional corruption, and the particular vulnerability of children in communities without resources or power to demand protection. The monster is gone, reduced to a footnote in criminal justice history. But the lessons his case teaches remain urgent. That evil often wears familiar faces, that authority can be a weapon in the hands of predators, that communities must actively protect their vulnerable members rather than passively trusting that systems will function as intended, and that silence, however understandable, however self-protective, ultimately enables the very horrors it seeks to avoid. The children of San Luis de la Paz stopped screaming after Dominguez went to prison. But in a deeper sense, their screams echo still, a reminder that justice delayed is trauma multiplied, and that the price of willful blindness is always paid by those least able to bear it. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Bloody Innkeeper. A true crime horror. They came seeking shelter. They left in pieces. The floorboards wouldn't stop weeping. For 17 years, travelers who checked into the White Hart and never checked out. They simply vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness that festered behind Belle Gunna's smile and the locked door of room 7. But buildings remember what humans forget. They hold on to screams the way wood holds on to blood. And when authorities finally tore through those walls in 1908, they didn't find guests. They found a cemetery, a vertical graveyard where human remains had been stacked, stored, and hidden like dirty secrets between the studs and beams. This is the story of the woman who turned hospitality into hunting, who perfected the art of making people disappear, and who discovered that the perfect hiding place for a body isn't in the ground. It's inside the very walls where victims drew their last breath. Welcome to the house that fed on strangers. The White Hart Inn stood at the crossroads of nowhere and forgotten, a 2-story establishment that hunched against the Norwegian landscape like a predator waiting for prey. Built in 1891, the structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its windows dark even in daylight, its doorway a mouth that swallowed travelers whole. Belle Gunnas purchased the property with money no one could trace. Arriving with a past she never discussed and eyes that held the kind of emptiness that makes animals nervous. She was a large woman, not fat, but built like someone who understood physical labor, someone whose hands knew the weight of heavy things. Her face carried a pleasant enough arrangement of features, the kind that disappeared from memory the moment you looked away. This ordinariness became her greatest weapon. Guests saw a hard-working innkeeper, a woman alone trying to make her way in a difficult world. They never saw the predator measuring them for their grave. The inn attracted a specific kind of visitor, traveling salesmen with sample cases, immigrant workers carrying their life savings in sewn pockets, drifters whose absence would barely register in a world that had already forgotten them. Belle had an instinct for spotting them, the ones nobody would miss, the ones whose disappearance would create no ripples. She'd greet them at the door with flour on her apron and warmth in her voice, showing them to their rooms with hands that would later drag their cooling bodies to her workshop of horrors. Room 7 sat at the end of the second-floor hallway. Guests who stayed there always commented on the same things. The door that locked from the outside, the window that had been nailed shut, the strange chemical smell that soap couldn't quite mask. Most ignored these details, too tired from travel to care. Those who did express concern would hear Belle's practiced explanation. A previous guest had attempted suicide, you understand, and she'd taken precautions. The lie slipped from her tongue like oil. Her method revealed a mind that understood efficiency and cruelty in equal measure. She'd wait until deep night, when sleep had rendered her victims vulnerable, then enter with a chloroform-soaked cloth pressed against struggling faces. Some woke during the process, their muffled screams absorbed by walls that had learned to keep secrets. Others slipped from dreams into death without ever knowing the transition. Belle preferred the former. There was something she enjoyed about the recognition in their eyes, that final moment when they understood that kindness had been costume, that safety had been illusion, that the woman with flour on her apron was the last face they'd ever see. What came after the killing was where Belle's true nature emerged. She didn't simply dispose of bodies. She dismembered them with the precision of someone who'd studied anatomy, or at least someone who'd practiced extensively. Her basement contained a collection of tools that would have made a surgeon envious. Bone saws that could separate joints cleanly, knives sharpened to edges so fine they could peel skin from muscle in single strips, a butcher's block stained so deeply that no amount of scrubbing could return it to its original color. She worked through the night, reducing human beings to component parts. Heads separated from necks, arms removed at shoulders and elbows, legs disarticulated at hips and knees. The torso itself split open, organs removed and disposed of separately. She wrapped these pieces in oilcloth, then canvas, then burlap, layers of fabric to contain the leakage to trap the smell. And then came the hiding. The White Hart Inn was a structure designed for secrets. Belle knew every hollow space, every gap between studs, every void beneath floorboards. She'd purchased the building with renovation in mind, but not the kind that improved guest comfort. She created hiding places, false walls with just enough space to slide a wrapped bundle, floor cavities that could swallow parcels of flesh and bone, spaces in the attic where the slope of the roof created triangular voids perfect for storage. The first victim was a Norwegian immigrant named Anders Olsen. He'd arrived in the spring of 1891, carrying everything he owned in a single trunk and wearing a money belt that contained $400, his entire savings from 5 years of work in America. He was traveling home to Oslo, stopping at the inn for a single night's rest. Bell served him dinner, listened to his stories, smiled at his broken English. He went to bed full and content, pleased to have found such pleasant accommodation. By morning, Anders Olsen had ceased to exist. His remains went into the walls of the dining room, positioned between studs in a space so narrow that discovering them would require demolition. His trunk and money disappeared into Bell's possession. His absence registered nowhere except in Oslo, where a family waited for a son who would never arrive. The pattern established itself with Anders. It repeated with Eric Hansen, a traveling tinker whose wagon Bell burned and whose tools she sold. It continued with Johanna Berg, one of the few female victims, a widow carrying her late husband's gold watch and inheritance money. Johanna's screams lasted longer than most. Bell had to use more chloroform, had to press harder. The struggle left bruises on Bell's arms that she covered with long sleeves. Over months that became years, the White Hart Inn transformed into a vertical cemetery. Bodies filled the walls like insulation. The space beneath the parlor floor became crowded with remains wrapped so tightly they resembled logs. The attic accumulated bundles that Bell stacked with the care of someone organizing a pantry. She kept mental records of where everyone went. This wall held the traveling salesman from Bergen. That floor cavity contained the German carpenter. The attic's northwest corner stored the 3 Swedish brothers who'd made the mistake of traveling together. The inn developed a reputation, though not the kind that raised suspicion. Locals whispered that it felt wrong somehow, that animals refused to approach it, that children would cross the street rather than walk past its door. Guests who stayed in rooms other than room 7 reported nightmares of suffocation, dreams where walls closed in and floorboards opened into pits. Many checked out early, offering vague explanations about feeling unwell. Bell always smiled and returned their money, pleased to see them go. They weren't the right kind of victim anyway, they'd be missed. By 1895, the White Hart Inn had consumed at least 15 people, though the true number lived only in Bell's memory. The building itself began to show signs of its terrible purpose. Stains appeared on wallpaper that couldn't be explained. The smell, despite Bell's constant scrubbing with lye and vinegar, never fully disappeared. It lurked in corners, emerged from heating vents, a sweet rot odor that guests attributed to poor plumbing or dead animals in the walls. They were half right. Bell's confidence grew with each successful kill. She stopped being cautious, stopped limiting herself to isolated drifters. She began to see every guest as potential profit, every traveler as walking wealth waiting to be claimed. The inn had trained her, taught her that murder without consequence was simply a matter of choosing the right victims and maintaining the right facade. She believed herself untouchable, protected by the very ordinariness that had always defined her. This belief would carry her forward into even darker territory, and eventually it would architect her destruction. The basement of the White Hart Inn existed in perpetual twilight. 2 small windows set high in the foundation walls allowed only grudging amounts of daylight to penetrate, creating a space that felt separate from the world above, a pocket dimension where normal rules didn't apply. Bell had transformed this underground chamber into something between a butcher's workshop and a surgical theater, a room designed for the efficient processing of human bodies. The centerpiece was a massive oak table, 8 feet long and stained so thoroughly with blood that the wood had darkened to near black. Its surface bore countless knife marks, grooves worn by repeated use, burns from the libel used to dissolve flesh from bone. Leather straps bolted to each corner allowed her to secure bodies when they arrived still twitching, when death hadn't quite finished its work. She'd learned early that even corpses could seem to move, muscles contracting in death spasms, limbs shifting as rigor mortis set in. The straps prevented these disturbances. Her tool collection expanded with each kill. She started with kitchen implements, a heavy cleaver for breaking through spine and bone, a fillet knife for separating muscle from skeleton, a meat saw for the larger cuts. But as her work became more sophisticated, so did her equipment. She acquired surgical saws with teeth fine enough to cut through bone without splintering. She purchased scalpels from a medical supply catalog, telling the proprietor she needed them for preparing game animals. She invested in a bone crusher, a vice-like device designed for rendering animal carcasses that worked equally well on human femurs and skulls. The kill that forced Bell to expand her methods came in the autumn of 1896. His name was Thomas Crowley, an Irish laborer built like an ox, muscle layered over a frame that topped 6 feet. He'd survived a childhood of poverty, a transatlantic crossing in steerage, and 5 years of brutal work on the American railroads. But he couldn't survive one night at the White Hart Inn. Thomas required more chloroform than Bell anticipated. His size meant he absorbed the chemical differently, his body fighting the sedation with stubborn vitality. She had to use the cloth 3 times, pressing it against his thrashing face while his hands, massive things that could bend iron rails, clawed at her arms. When he finally went still, Belle found herself breathing hard, her dress torn, scratch marks bleeding on her forearms. This one had been dangerous. This one had almost escaped. The dismemberment of Thomas Crowley took 2 full nights. His bones resisted the saw. His joints required tremendous force to disarticulate. His muscle tissue seemed to fight the knife even in death. Belle worked until her hands cramped, until her back screamed with pain, until the basement air grew thick with the copper tang of blood and the sharper smell of exposed viscera. She reduced him piece by piece, creating parcels small enough to hide but discovering that his very size presented a problem. She was running out of hiding places in the inn structure. This problem forced innovation. Belle began taking remains outside the building, burying them in the extensive gardens she maintained around the property. She'd dig at night, creating graves 3 and 4 feet deep, then covering them with lime to accelerate decomposition before filling them with soil. She planted over these graves roses mostly, which thrived with obscene vigor in the enriched earth. The garden became a secondary cemetery, rows of blooms marking the locations of the dead. But burial was time-consuming and risky. Neighbors might see her digging. Ground that had been disturbed was visible to trained eyes. So Belle continued to prefer the walls, the floors, the hidden spaces of the inn itself. She became expert at architectural concealment, studying the building structure with the intensity of an engineer. She discovered that the chimney's interior provided storage. Bodies could be lowered down from the attic, suspended by chains in the dark vertical shaft. She found that the space between the first and second floors, accessible through a panel she installed in a closet, could accommodate flattened remains if she removed enough bone to make them pliable. Her most disturbing innovation involved the inn's well. Located in the basement, the well had supposedly gone dry years before Belle purchased the property. In reality, it still contained water, 30 feet down, cold and black, an underground pool that never saw daylight. Belle began using it for disposal of parts she couldn't easily hide. Organs, excess fat, smaller bones. She dropped these pieces into the darkness, listening for the splash that confirmed they'd reached the water. Over time, the well became a concentrated soup of human remains, a vertical mass grave where decomposition happened in slow, cold darkness. The spring of 1898 brought 2 victims in quick succession. First came Maria Johansdotter, a young Swedish woman traveling alone to meet a fiancé in Chicago. She carried letters describing him, photographs showing a young man with hopeful eyes, and an engagement ring he'd mailed ahead. Belle found the ring first when she sorted through Maria's belongings. A small diamond set in gold, worth perhaps $50. Maria herself provided additional value. Jewelry sewn into her corset, paper money hidden in a boot heel, gold coins tucked inside a Bible's hollowed pages. Maria's killing was efficient. The chloroform worked quickly on her small frame. She barely struggled, transitioning from sleep to death with only a few twitching movements. But her disposal presented challenges. Maria had been pretty, memorably so, and Belle worried that her disappearance might generate more attention than usual. So she took extra care with the dismemberment, ensured that every piece was thoroughly wrapped, divided the remains between multiple locations throughout the inn. Maria's head went into the attic. Her torso found space beneath the kitchen floor. Her limbs disappeared into various wall cavities. The ring and money went into Belle's strongbox. The letters and photographs burned in the kitchen stove. 3 days after Maria disappeared, Hans Knudsen checked into the inn. He was a carpenter by trade, Norwegian by birth, carrying tools that Belle recognized as valuable and a money belt that suggested savings. Hans made the mistake of being friendly, of talking too much over dinner, of mentioning that he was traveling alone and that nobody expected him at his destination for another week. He essentially provided Belle with permission to kill him, but Hans fought. When the chloroform pressed against his face, some survival instinct jerked him awake. His eyes opened wide, consciousness returning with terrible clarity. He saw Belle's face hovering above him, saw the cloth in her hand, understood everything in a single moment. He threw her off with strength born of terror, his carpenter's muscles launching her across the room. Then he ran. The chase through the dark inn became the closest Belle ever came to being caught. Hans made it to the stairs, began descending toward the front door and escape. But Belle was faster than her size suggested, motivated by necessity. She caught him on the landing, her butcher knife, grabbed from the kitchen as she pursued, plunging into his back between shoulder blades. The blade struck spine, failed to penetrate fully. Hans screamed, the sound echoing through the empty building. Belle stabbed again and again and again. 7 times the knife rose and fell. 7 times it entered flesh. Hans collapsed on the stairs, bleeding from multiple wounds, his screams dissolving into wet, gasping sounds. She dragged him back to room 7, leaving a trail of blood that took hours to clean. Hans died slowly, his lung punctured, blood filling his chest cavity. Belle watched him drown internally, his eyes fixed on her face, his mouth working around words he no longer had breath to speak. When he finally stopped moving, she felt something that might have been relief or might have been disappointment. The kill had been messy, inefficient, too much evidence left behind. Hans's dismemberment was furious. Belle hacked rather than cut, broke rather than separated. Her anger at his resistance translated into violence against his corpse. She reduced him to pieces smaller than usual, fragments that barely resembled their human origin. These pieces scattered throughout the inn. Some in walls, some beneath floors, some in the chimney, some down the well. Hans Knudsen became the most distributed victim. His remains spread so widely that reconstructing him would have been impossible even if every piece had been found. The near escape shook Belle's confidence temporarily. She became more cautious, administered more chloroform, waited longer to ensure victims were truly unconscious before beginning her work. But the caution faded as weeks passed without consequence. Hans hadn't escaped. Maria remained successfully hidden. The inn kept its secrets. Belle's sense of invulnerability returned, stronger than before. She'd survived a victim fighting back. She'd managed the messiest kill of her career. She was untouchable. This belief carried her into 1899 and beyond, into a period where the killing accelerated, where the white heart consumed victims with increasing hunger. The walls were full. The floors were crowded. The well had become thick with decomposing flesh. But Belle couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Murder had become more than profit. It had become purpose, identity, the core of who she was. The inn had shaped her, and she had shaped it in return. Together, they formed a single entity, a predator that looked like a building that functioned as a grave. By the turn of the century, Belle Gunness had refined murder into routine. The White Hart Inn operated with the efficiency of a factory, processing human life into concealment and profit. Her victims now numbered somewhere beyond 30. She'd stopped keeping exact count, the numbers blurring together in memory. Each kill followed a pattern so practiced it had become almost boring. Chloroform, dismemberment, disposal, the acquisition of belongings. Wake up, commit murder, clean up, repeat. The monotony drove her to seek variation. She began to experiment with her methods, finding new ways to extract entertainment from the terrible work. Some victims she allowed to wake during the dismemberment, dosing them with just enough chloroform to paralyze but not enough to render unconscious. She wanted to see their eyes as the knife began its work, wanted to watch awareness trapped inside an unresponsive body. These kills took longer, provided more satisfaction. The screaming happened inside their skulls where only Belle could see it reflected in desperate eyes. She also began to take trophies beyond mere money. A locket from a woman who'd clutched it even in death. A pocket watch that had belonged to a victim's father. Photographs from wallets. Faces of people who had loved the dead and didn't know they should stop waiting. Belle kept these items in a wooden box hidden in her bedroom, taking them out occasionally to examine in lamplight. Each object connected to a specific memory. How that person had begged, what sounds they'd made, the particular way their life had ended. The spring of 1902 brought a victim who altered Belle's trajectory. Andrew Helgelian arrived at the White Hart Inn with his brother, Oscar. The brothers were Norwegian immigrants who'd worked as farmhands and saved meticulously. They were traveling together back to Norway for a family emergency. Their mother was dying and wanted to see her sons one final time. Together, they carried nearly $1,500 in cash and banknotes, more money than Belle had taken from any single kill. The problem was twofold. Two adult men, both healthy and strong, both alert. Taking them simultaneously seemed impossible. Belle considered turning them away, but that money called to her. $1,500 represented opportunity, expansion, security. So she devised a plan that required patience. She rented them separate rooms. Andrew in room 7, Oscar in room 3 at the opposite end of the hall. She served them dinner, poured drinks that she dosed with laudanum. Not enough to incapacitate, just enough to make them sleepy, to ensure deeper unconsciousness when it came. She waited until after midnight, then crept to room 3 first. Oscar Helgelian died without waking. The chloroform worked perfectly, his laudanum-depressed system unable to fight the chemical. He transitioned from sleep to death in perhaps 90 seconds, his breathing simply ceasing, his heart stopping like a clock winding down. Belle left him there temporarily and moved to room 7. Andrew proved more resistant. He woke as the cloth touched his face, his hand shooting up to grab Belle's wrist. His eyes opened, confused, frightened, beginning to understand. Belle pressed harder, using her weight advantage, forcing the chloroform-soaked fabric against his mouth and nose. Andrew bucked beneath her, his free hand clawing at her face, his legs kicking. The struggle lasted nearly 3 minutes, an eternity when you're trying to murder someone, before Andrew's movements weakened, slowed, stopped. The disposal of 2 bodies in one night pushed Belle to her physical limits. She worked until dawn, dismembering both brothers in her basement workshop, creating twice the usual number of parcels. The Helgelian brothers went into the walls of multiple rooms, their remains mixed together so thoroughly that sorting one from the other would have been impossible. Their money went into Belle's strongbox. Their possessions burned. Their mother died in Norway, still waiting for sons who would never arrive, never knowing that they'd made it within 50 miles of her deathbed before meeting their end. The double murder emboldened Belle. If she could successfully kill 2 men in one night, what other boundaries existed? She began to accept guests she would have previously turned away, couples traveling together, groups of 3 workers sharing a room to save money. Her ambition expanded with her confidence. In August of 1903, she killed an entire family. The Hansons, mother, father, and teenage daughter, were traveling from Wisconsin to Minnesota, stopping at the inn for a single night. Belle saw opportunity. The parents clearly had money, evidenced by their clothes and luggage, and a family disappearing together was actually less suspicious than individuals vanishing one by one. Missing persons investigations focused on specific people. An entire family simply appeared to have changed their plans. She poisoned their dinner with arsenic, a method she'd never used before. It was cleaner than chloroform, didn't require physical struggle, but it was also slower and more visible. The Hansons began vomiting within an hour, their bodies convulsing as the poison attacked their systems. The daughter, only 16, took longest to die, her youth and health fighting the arsenic for nearly 4 hours. Her screaming brought Belle downstairs multiple times to check that the sound hadn't escaped the inn's walls. When they finally expired, Belle faced her largest disposal challenge yet. 3 complete bodies, including a teenager small enough that the usual dismemberment seemed excessive. She worked for 2 consecutive nights, sleeping only in brief stretches, driven by necessity and stimulated by the sheer scale of the work. The Hansons were distributed throughout the inn's structure, their remains added to the architectural cemetery that the White Hart had become. Their wagon and horses Belle sold to a farmer 20 miles away, claiming they'd been abandoned by travelers. Their money, nearly $800, disappeared into her strongbox. The Hanson murders represented a turning point. Belle had crossed from opportunistic killing to active hunting, from passive acceptance of suitable victims to active creation of killing opportunities. She began to advertise in Norwegian-language newspapers, offering accommodations specifically targeted at immigrants. She positioned the White Hart Inn as a safe haven for Scandinavian travelers, a place where their language was spoken and their culture understood. The advertisements were bait, and they worked brilliantly. Victims began arriving with increased frequency. Ole Sorensen, who responded to an advertisement promising Norwegian hospitality. Ingrid Larsen, a widow seeking information about travel to North Dakota. The Jorgensen brothers, who saw the inn's notice in a Minneapolis newspaper. Each advertisement brought new prey, each arrival added to the count of the dead. The inn's walls continued to fill, the available hiding spaces shrinking as the body count climbed toward 40, then 50. Belle's method for the dismemberment had evolved into a precise system. She worked from the same routine for each body. Decapitation first, then removal of limbs at major joints, opening of the torso to remove organs, crushing of the rib cage to flatten it. Each body reduced to approximately 8 to 10 major pieces, each piece small enough to hide but large enough that creating them didn't require excessive cutting. She could complete the full process in roughly 3 hours, start to finish, working with the efficiency of practice. But practice brought its own dangers. Belle had become so comfortable with murder that she'd stopped being cautious. She accepted guests without properly vetting them. She killed people who had made specific plans that their absence would disrupt. She left evidence where previously she'd been meticulous about cleaning. The inn itself had begun to testify against her. The smell had intensified to the point where even heavy-handed explanations couldn't dismiss it. Stains had appeared on exterior walls where fluids had leached through from interior hiding places. The structure itself seemed to be decomposing along with its hidden contents. The winter of 1907 brought unusually warm weather to Norway, and with the warmth came acceleration of decay. Bodies that had been frozen in wall cavities during previous winters now began to break down more rapidly. The smell became overwhelming, noticeable from the road, commented on by every guest. Belle tried to mask it with lime, with vinegar, with constant fires in every fireplace. Nothing worked. The White Hart Inn had become saturated with death. The building itself transformed into evidence. Guests stopped coming. Word had spread through the Norwegian immigrant community. The White Hart Inn was cursed or haunted or simply wrong. People avoided it, choosing to travel further to find other accommodation. Belle's hunting ground had dried up, her carefully constructed system collapsing under the weight of its own success. Too many bodies in too small a space. Too much death for even walls to contain. She should have stopped then, should have closed the inn, disappeared, started fresh somewhere new. But Belle had invested 17 years in this place, had built her entire operation around its structure and isolation. More critically, she'd been killing for so long that the thought of stopping seemed impossible. Murder had become her identity. The inn was her masterpiece. Abandoning either meant admitting that it had all been temporary, that the work couldn't continue forever. So she didn't stop. Instead, she made the decision that would ultimately destroy her. She began to burn the bodies, attempting to erase the evidence that had accumulated beyond her ability to hide. The fires started in the basement furnace, but the smell of burning human flesh is distinctive, unforgettable, and impossible to explain. Neighbors noticed. Local officials received complaints. And for the first time in 17 years, people began to wonder what exactly happened at the White Hart Inn. Detective Lars Christensen received the assignment on a gray March morning in 1908. Multiple complaints had been filed regarding the White Hart Inn, reports of terrible smells, observations of smoke from the chimney at odd hours, concerns from neighbors who hadn't seen certain guests leave despite their wagons disappearing from the property. The complaints alone wouldn't have warranted investigation, but they coincided with a missing persons report from America. A man named Oscar Helgelian had written to Norwegian authorities asking about his brother, Andrew, who had disappeared 6 years earlier somewhere near the White Hart Inn. Christensen was a methodical investigator, experienced in cases where evidence had been deliberately obscured. He began not with the inn itself, but with records, guest registries, newspaper advertisements, reports from neighboring businesses. What he found troubled him. The White Hart Inn had hosted hundreds of guests over 17 years, but almost no regular customers, no repeat visitors, no one who recommended it to others. People came to the inn and then simply vanished from documentation. No onward travel records, no return addresses, nothing. On March 23, 1908, Christensen arrived at the White Hart Inn with 2 constables and a warrant to search the premises. Belle met them at the door wearing her usual apron, flour dust on her hands, the perfect picture of domestic normality. She smiled when Christensen explained the warrant, invited them inside with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. That confidence was performance. Behind her eyes, calculations were being made about escape routes, about how much time she had, about whether killing 3 law enforcement officers was feasible. The search began in the basement. Christensen descended the stairs and immediately stopped. The smell hit him like a physical force, the dense, sweet rot odor of decomposition that no amount of ventilation could dispel. His constables covered their faces with handkerchiefs. Christensen forced himself forward, his lamp illuminating Belle's workshop. The oak table dominated the space, its surface telling a story of repeated violence. The tool collection hung on wall hooks, saws still bearing tissue fragments, knives with stains no cleaning could remove, the bone crusher with hair caught in its mechanical teeth. Christensen recognized what he was looking at. This was a killing room, a space designed for taking humans apart. He turned to Belle, who had followed them down, her face carefully neutral. "What is this room used for?" Christensen asked. "Butchering," Belle replied calmly. "I prepare game animals, deer mostly, pigs in the autumn." "This table has seen more than animal death," Christensen said. Belle shrugged. "I can't control what you imagine, detective." The search expanded to the rest of the building. Christensen's constables began tapping walls, listening for hollow spaces, searching for irregularities in the inn's structure. In room 7, one constable noticed that the floorboards sounded different in one corner, emptier somehow with an echo that suggested void space beneath. He pried up a board, then another, then a third. The smell that emerged drove everyone from the room, a concentrated blast of decay so powerful it induced immediate vomiting. When they returned with masks and lamps, they found a cavity beneath the floor. Inside it, wrapped in layers of disintegrating fabric, were human remains. Not a complete body. This was an arm, severed at the shoulder, the flesh partially mummified, the bone visible through gaps in the tissue. The constable who'd found it staggered from the room and vomited again in the hallway. Christensen stood over the cavity, his lamp illuminating this first piece of evidence, understanding that if there was one body part, there would be more. Belle had disappeared. While the constables investigated room 7, she'd slipped out of the inn and vanished into the Norwegian landscape. A search was organized immediately, but Belle had 17 years of planning for this moment. She'd prepared escape routes, hidden money, created false identities. The search would continue for weeks without success. Belle Gunness had become a ghost, leaving behind only her terrible legacy. The excavation of the White Hart Inn took 6 weeks. Christensen brought in carpenters, masons, laborers, anyone with the stomach for what needed to be done. They tore the building apart systematically, documenting every finding, mapping every location where remains appeared. What they discovered exceeded even Christensen's darkest expectations. The walls of the White Hart Inn contained at least 27 distinct sets of remains, some complete enough to identify as individual people, others fragmented and mixed. The floor cavities held another 15 bodies in various states of preservation. The attic revealed bundles that had dried and mummified in the heat of summer, preserved corpses wrapped in canvas. The chimney, when finally explored, contained a vertical stack of body parts that had been lowered on chains, creating a hanging gallery of the dead. The well proved to be the worst discovery. When workers finally drained it, they found the bottom layered with human bones and tissue that had stewed in cold water for years. The organic material had separated from bones, creating a thick sediment of decomposed flesh. The bones themselves, femurs, ribs, skulls, lay scattered like fossils in an archaeological dig. The worker who first entered the drained well emerged screaming, his mind broken by what he'd seen. The garden revealed another 16 burial sites, each marked by Bell's roses. The plants had fed on their fertilizer, growing with obscene vitality, their blooms especially large and red. Workers dug up each grave, finding bodies that had been treated with lime, remains that had partially dissolved, skeletons bent into positions that suggested they'd been alive when buried. The final count remained uncertain. Authorities documented at least 78 distinct individuals based on bone counts and anatomical reconstruction, but the mixing of remains made exact identification impossible. Some victims had been so thoroughly dismembered and distributed that only fragments remained. A jawbone here, a femur there, pieces of people scattered throughout the building like terrible confetti. Identification proved challenging. Many victims were immigrants who'd traveled alone, whose absence had barely registered, but some could be named. Anders Olsen was identified by dental work and a distinctive healed fracture in his left arm. Maria Johansdottir was recognized by jewelry found near her remains. The Hansen family was identified by their daughter's locket, still clutched in the skeletal hand that held it. Andrew Helgelian's pocket watch, engraved with his initials, provided confirmation of his fate. The investigation into Bell's history revealed a woman who had been killing for far longer than the White Hart Inn suggested. Records showed she'd owned a previous property in the United States, a farmhouse in Illinois that had burned under suspicious circumstances. Insurance had paid out for the fire and for the death of her husband, who'd perished in the blaze. Investigators traveling to Illinois found that Bell's first property also concealed bodies. At least 14 sets of remains were excavated from the burnt farmhouse's grounds. Bell had been a serial killer for over 25 years, possibly claiming more than 100 victims across 2 countries. The question of why drove public fascination. Psychologists of the era examined Bell's life, searching for the origin of such sustained violence. They found an unremarkable childhood, no obvious trauma, nothing that predicted the monster she'd become. The consensus was that Bell simply lacked conscience. She was what we would now identify as a psychopath, someone for whom other humans registered only as objects to be used or eliminated. The killing itself provided satisfaction beyond mere profit. It gave her power, control, proof of her superiority. The White Hart Inn was demolished in the summer of 1908. Workers dismantled it board by board, burning every piece that had contacted human remains, which meant nearly all of it. The property was excavated to a depth of 10 feet, ensuring no evidence remained underground. Even then, locals reported that the ground stayed strange. Nothing would grow there, animals avoided it, and visitors reported feeling watched by invisible eyes. Bell Gunness was never captured. Sightings were reported across Scandinavia, then in England, then South America. None were confirmed. The prevailing theory suggests she successfully disappeared into America's immigrant communities, possibly continuing to kill under different names and methods. Some investigators believed she died during her escape, suicide, or accident, and that her body lay somewhere in the Norwegian wilderness, but no corpse was ever found. Bell remained free, her fate as mysterious as her victims had been. The psychological impact of the White Heart in case resonated for decades. It fundamentally altered how European law enforcement approached missing persons investigations, particularly involving immigrant populations. It revealed how easily people could disappear when society didn't track their movements carefully. It exposed the vulnerability of those who existed on the margins: the poor, the foreign, the isolated. The case also illuminated the capacity for human evil to sustain itself over decades. Belle had killed methodically and continuously for 25 years, possibly longer. She'd refined her methods, perfected her disposal techniques, learned from each victim. She represented a new kind of criminal that psychology was only beginning to understand: the organized, patient predator who hunted humans with the calculation of a professional. For the families of victims, closure remained incomplete. Many people who'd gone missing near the White Hart Inn were never conclusively identified. Their remains were buried in a mass grave outside Oslo, marked by a simple stone that read "The Unknown, Lost to the White Hart." Families traveled from across Scandinavia and America to stand before that marker, mourning people they'd spent years searching for, finally understanding that hope had always been a lie. The trial that never happened haunted the justice system. Belle's absence meant no accountability, no public reckoning, no opportunity for victims' families to face the woman who destroyed their lives. The legal system had failed fundamentally, not through incompetence, but through the simple fact that Belle had escaped. Questions lingered about whether earlier intervention might have saved lives, whether the complaints and suspicions should have triggered investigation years before they did. Detective Lars Christensen never recovered from what he'd seen at the White Hart Inn. The 6 weeks spent excavating that building, documenting the remains, reconstructing the murders, it broke something essential in him. He continued working for another 3 years before retiring early, moving to a remote fishing village where he spent his remaining years staring at the sea. Colleagues who visited reported that he barely spoke, that his eyes held a distance that suggested he was still standing in that basement, still smelling that smell, still seeing what walls could hold. The constables who'd assisted in the excavation faced similar psychological damage. One committed suicide within a year, leaving a note that simply read, "I can't stop seeing them." Another became obsessed with finding Belle, spending his entire savings on a private investigation that yielded nothing. The third descended into alcoholism, his life dissolving as he tried to drown memories that wouldn't die. The workers who'd torn apart the inn reported lingering nightmares. Men who'd spent entire careers in construction, who'd seen industrial accidents and workplace deaths, found that the White Hart Inn exceeded their capacity to process trauma. They dismantled a building that had become a living tomb, touched walls saturated with violence, handled remains that represented not accidents or natural death but deliberate, sustained murder. Several refused payment, wanting nothing that connected them to the property. Others took their wages and immediately donated them to churches, as though money touched by that place was cursed. The photographs taken during the excavation were sealed by Norwegian authorities, deemed too disturbing for public viewing. Only investigators and select officials were permitted to see them. Those images, blurred by the primitive photography of 1908 but still clear enough to convey horror, showed the true scope of Belle's work. Bodies folded into spaces that seemed too small to contain them, skeletal hands reaching from wall cavities as though trying to escape. The vertical stack of remains in the chimney, creating a ladder of death. The well's bottom covered in bones like a grotesque mosaic. One photograph, which eventually leaked to newspapers despite official attempts to suppress it, showed the dining room wall after it had been opened. Between the studs, clearly visible, was a wrapped bundle positioned vertically. The fabric had partially disintegrated, revealing a human skull, its empty sockets seeming to stare directly at the camera. That image became the public face of the White Hart in horror, reproduced in newspapers across Europe and America, transforming the case from regional tragedy to international sensation. The media coverage was relentless and often sensationalized. Newspapers competed to provide the most lurid details, sometimes inventing elements that had no basis in fact. Belle was described as a vampire, a demon in human form, a she-devil of the north. Artists created illustrations showing her looming over terrified victims, her hands dripping blood, her face twisted into expressions of sadistic pleasure. These depictions bore little resemblance to reality. Belle had been methodical and cold, not theatrical or emotionally invested in her victims' suffering, but they satisfied public desire for monsters to look monstrous. The case inspired legislative changes across Scandinavia. Governments implemented better tracking systems for immigrants, required innkeepers to maintain detailed guest registries that were regularly inspected, and established protocols for investigating missing persons reports more aggressively. These reforms came too late for Belle's victims, but potentially saved future lives by making it harder for predators to operate undetected. The psychological community seized on the case as evidence for emerging theories about criminal psychopathy. Belle became a case study, analyzed in academic papers and medical journals. Her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing sustained atrocities fascinated researchers. She demonstrated that evil didn't require obvious warning signs, that the most dangerous predators often appeared completely ordinary. This understanding would later influence criminal profiling and forensic psychology, shaping how law enforcement identified and tracked serial killers. Religious communities struggled with theological implications. How could God permit such evil to flourish for so long? Why had Belle's victims not been protected? These questions troubled pastors and priests, who found traditional explanations inadequate. Some concluded that Belle represented a test of faith, that her existence challenged believers to maintain conviction despite incomprehensible suffering. Others saw her as evidence of humanity's fallen nature, proof that some souls had embraced damnation so completely they ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. The property where the White Hart Inn stood remained vacant for decades. Multiple attempts were made to develop it, proposals for new construction, plans to turn it into farmland, suggestions to use it as a memorial site. All failed. Workers hired to prepare the land reported equipment malfunctions, accidents, and overwhelming feelings of dread that made continuing impossible. The few structures erected there collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Eventually, the land was abandoned entirely, left to return to wilderness. Local folklore transformed the site into a haunted place. Stories circulated about visitors hearing screams from empty air, about seeing figures in windows of buildings that no longer existed, about animals dying when they crossed the property line. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, though few accepted the challenge, and those who did typically fled before dawn. The White Hart Inn had physically disappeared, but its presence lingered like a stain that weather couldn't wash away. The victims themselves became almost secondary to the story of their killer. Historical accounts focused on Belle, her methods, her psychology, her escape, while those she murdered remained largely anonymous statistics. But each number represented a complete human life, a person with hopes and histories and people who loved them. Anders Olsen had been saving to build a house for his aging parents. Maria Johansdottir had dreamed of starting a bakery with her fiancé. Thomas Crowley had survived poverty and immigration, only to die within sight of the prosperity he'd worked toward. Their stories ended at the White Hart Inn, but they'd lived full lives before Belle erased them. Some victims' families spent years, even decades, trying to recover remains for proper burial. The mixing of bodies made identification nearly impossible for many. Forensic science in 1908 lacked the tools to distinguish individuals once they'd been dismembered and combined. Families were left with uncertainty. These bones might be their loved one, or might be someone else, or might be fragments of multiple people. That ambiguity created a special kind of torment, grief without closure, mourning without resolution. The question that haunted everyone who studied the case was simple and unanswerable. How many? Belle had operated for at least 25 years, possibly longer. The White Hart Inn alone yielded evidence of 78 victims, but that number was acknowledged as incomplete. Her Illinois property added at least 14 more. But what about the gaps in her timeline? What about the years before Illinois, or the periods when she traveled? Conservative estimates suggested Belle Gunness killed somewhere between 100 and 150 people. Some investigators believed the true number exceeded 200. The exact count died with Belle wherever she'd gone. The legacy of the White Heart extended far beyond the immediate horror. It revealed systemic failures in how society tracked vulnerable populations, in how law enforcement responded to suspicions, in how the architecture of daily life could conceal atrocity. Belle had exploited gaps in the social fabric, targeting people whose absence wouldn't trigger immediate investigation, using isolation and respectability as camouflage for sustained murder. In the years following the discovery, several other cases emerged that showed similar patterns. Innkeepers and landlords who'd murdered guests, hidden bodies in structural spaces, operated for years without detection. The White Heart case provided the template for recognizing these situations, gave investigators knowledge about what to look for, where to search, how to interpret suspicious circumstances. Belle's legacy, ironically, made it harder for future predators to replicate her success. The building materials from the demolished inn were transported to a remote location and burned in a massive pyre that lasted 3 days. Workers fed the flames constantly, ensuring every board, every nail, every fragment was consumed. The ashes were collected and buried in an unmarked location, as though the inn itself needed a grave. Even the foundation stones were removed and crushed, then scattered across miles of coastline. The authorities wanted nothing to remain, no relic that could become a shrine or attraction. The White Heart had to be erased as completely as Belle had tried to erase her victims. But erasure proved impossible. The case lived on in memory, in documentation, in the continuing absence of those who died there. It became a cautionary tale about the monsters that hide behind ordinary faces, about the dangers of isolation, about the importance of paying attention when people disappear. Parents warned children about trusting strangers. Travelers learned to be suspicious of too welcoming hosts. The inn's horror educated a generation in the reality of human predation. Detective Christensen, in his final interview before retiring, was asked what he'd learned from the White Hart Inn. His answer was brief and haunted. That walls can hold more than we imagine, and that some people see other humans the way most of us see firewood, as things to be cut apart and used. Belle Gunness wasn't a monster from nightmares. She was real and she was patient, and for 25 years she was successful. That's what terrifies me most. Not what she did, but how easily she did it. The families of the victims, those who could be identified and those who remained anonymous, eventually established a memorial in Oslo. It consisted of 78 candles in glass holders, each representing a confirmed victim, arranged in the shape of a house. Once a year, on the anniversary of the inn's discovery, the candles were lit at sunset and allowed to burn through the night. Families would gather, speaking the names of the dead, ensuring that someone remembered them as people rather than statistics. Belle Gunness was never officially declared dead, though as decades passed, the likelihood of her survival diminished. Some investigators maintained she'd lived well into the 1940s, dying of natural causes under an assumed identity, never facing justice for her crimes. Others believed she'd met a violent end, either from someone who discovered her identity or from attempting to continue killing and finally encountering a victim who fought back successfully. The truth remained unknowable, another mystery in a case defined by them. The final word on the White Hart came from an unexpected source, a priest who'd performed the mass burial for unidentified victims. Asked what he'd said over those graves, he replied, "I told them they were remembered, even without names. I told them their suffering had ended, and I prayed that the woman who'd done this would face judgment, if not in this world, then certainly in the next. Because buildings can be torn down, and evidence can be destroyed, but some acts are recorded in places beyond our reach. The White Hart Inn is gone, but what happened there will never be forgotten. The walls confessed everything before they fell. The ground where the inn had stood remains empty today, more than a century later. No memorial marks the location by deliberate choice to prevent it from becoming a destination for those fascinated by darkness. But locals still avoid the area, still tell stories about the building that ate people, about the woman who turned hospitality into horror. Children growing up in nearby towns learn about Belle Gunness as a warning, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. The White Hart Inn existed for 17 years. In that time, it became a vertical cemetery, a place where the normal rules of civilized society ceased to function, where one woman's complete lack of conscience transformed architecture into accomplice. The building itself was both victim and participant, shaped by Belle into a tool for concealment, absorbing the evidence of her crimes until it could hold no more. When it finally confessed, when those walls gave up their secrets, the world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth: that horror doesn't always lurk in darkness. Sometimes it operates in daylight, behind painted walls and welcoming doors, wearing an apron and a smile, offering shelter to the weary. Sometimes the most dangerous place is the one that feels safe. And somewhere, perhaps, Belle Gunness lived out her days, carrying the memory of 78 confirmed victims and however many others were never found. Did she feel remorse? Did she dream of the faces she'd erased? Or did she simply move on, the way someone moves on from any finished work, looking ahead to whatever came next? We'll never know. She took those answers with her into whatever darkness finally claimed her. But the White Hart Inn remains in history as a testament to what humans are capable of when conscience dies and opportunity presents itself. The walls may be gone, but their confession echoes still. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Bedroom Butcher, Philip Herbert's Reign of Terror. They say evil wears many faces, but what happens when it wears the face of the man sleeping beside you? When darkness falls and bedroom doors close, we surrender to our most vulnerable state. We trust the walls around us. We trust the person lying next to us. But for 3 women who welcomed Philip Herbert into their most intimate spaces, that trust became a death sentence written in blood. This is the story of a monster who didn't lurk in shadows or stalk from alleyways. He murdered from within, turning sanctuaries into slaughterhouses, and love into a weapon more lethal than any blade. Picture yourself drifting off to sleep, your head resting on the pillow beside someone you've chosen to trust with your life. Now imagine that person watching you, waiting for that precise moment when consciousness slips away, when your defenses crumble completely. Imagine them reaching for something cold and heavy, their fingers wrapping around it with rehearsed precision. In your final seconds, you might open your eyes to see the face you kissed goodnight transformed into something inhuman, something that has been hiding behind tender words and gentle touches. This nightmare became reality for multiple women across England in the 1960s. Women who never suspected that the charming, soft-spoken Philip Herbert was calculating their murders even as he shared their beds. Welcome to the horrifying true story of Britain's bedroom butcher, a killer so cunning and remorseless that he turned intimacy itself into a hunting ground, leaving behind crime scenes so brutal that hardened detectives would carry the images to their graves. Philip Herbert looked like someone's favorite uncle. Average height, unremarkable features, a smile that came easily and often. Born in 1927 in the working-class neighborhoods of Birmingham, England, Herbert grew up during an era when Britain was clawing its way out of economic depression and into the machinery of war. His childhood offered no obvious red flags, no tortured animals, no violent outbursts that neighbors whispered about over garden fences. He was quiet, polite even, the kind of boy who held doors open and said, "Please" and "thank you" without prompting. But behind those ordinary brown eyes, something was fundamentally broken. Herbert's adolescence coincided with World War II, and like countless young men of his generation, he was conscripted into military service. The army gave him structure, discipline, and something else entirely, an education in violence that most of his peers found traumatizing but Herbert found fascinating. While other soldiers counted days until they could return home, Herbert seemed almost comfortable in the presence of death. He performed his duties efficiently, never questioning orders, never expressing the moral anguish that plagued so many of his fellow servicemen. When the war ended and Herbert returned to civilian life, he did what society expected. He found work as a laborer, moving between construction sites and factory floors with the same unremarkable efficiency he'd shown during his military service. He married, a quiet ceremony with few guests and even fewer displays of genuine emotion. His wife, whose name history has mercifully protected, found herself bound to a man who seemed perpetually distant, as though some essential part of him remained locked away where she could never reach it. The marriage was brief and childless. Herbert's wife later told authorities that living with him felt like sharing a house with a ghost. He was there but not present, his mind always somewhere else, processing thoughts he never shared. She described moments when she'd catch him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Not hatred exactly, but something equally cold. An assessment, a calculation. When she finally left him, citing irreconcilable differences, she had no idea she was saving her own life. Freed from the constraints of marriage, Herbert embarked on what would become his true vocation: serial seduction and murder. He moved through the working-class neighborhoods of northern England like a shark through murky waters, patient and methodical. His hunting ground was the world of lonely women, divorcees, and widows who yearned for companionship. For someone to share the weight of existence in post-war Britain, where rationing still lingered and optimism felt like a luxury few could afford. Herbert's method was devastatingly simple and ruthlessly effective. He would frequent pubs and social clubs, places where conversation flowed easily and defenses lowered with each passing pint. He never approached the flashy women, never targeted those who seemed confident or surrounded by friends. Instead, he identified the isolated ones, the women sitting slightly apart, nursing their drinks slowly, their eyes revealing a hunger for connection that made them perfect prey. His courtship routine was textbook manipulation disguised as genuine affection. He listened, truly listened, asking questions about their lives, their struggles, their dreams that had withered on the vine of disappointment. He offered sympathy without judgment, companionship without pressure. To these women, Philip Herbert seemed like an answer to prayers they'd barely dared to whisper. A decent man, kind man, someone who saw them not as burdens or used goods, but as worthy of love and attention. What they couldn't see was the predator's patience behind his gentle demeanor. Herbert never rushed. He allowed relationships to develop naturally, playing the role of devoted suitor with the skill of a seasoned actor. He brought small gifts, flowers purchased from corner vendors, chocolates saved from his modest wages. He spoke of futures together, of growing old side by side, of finally having found someone who understood him. Every word was a hook, every gesture bait for a trap whose jaws would eventually snap shut with bone-crushing finality. Brenda Parkin became Herbert's first confirmed victim, though investigators would later wonder if there had been others before her. Women whose deaths were attributed to accidents or natural causes because no one thought to look closer. Brenda was 38 years old, a factory worker whose husband had died 3 years earlier, leaving her alone in a small flat that felt larger and emptier with each passing season. She met Philip Herbert at a community dance in 1953, one of those church-sponsored events designed to bring lonely souls together under the respectable guise of wholesome entertainment. Herbert courted Brenda for 3 months before she invited him to move into her flat. To neighbors, they seemed like any other couple navigating the awkward territory between companionship and something deeper. Herbert was seen carrying groceries up the stairs, his arm occasionally around Brenda's waist, his expression one of contentment. Brenda herself seemed lighter, younger almost, as though Herbert's presence had lifted years of grief from her shoulders. No one heard them argue. No one witnessed violence or raised voices. The flat remained quiet, its windows revealing only the mundane domestic scenes of 2 people sharing space and meals and presumably a bed. This normalcy made what happened next all the more horrifying. On a cold November evening in 1953, Herbert waited until Brenda had fallen asleep beside him. The flat was silent except for the distant sounds of the city beyond the windows. Cars passing, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the ordinary soundtrack of urban existence. Brenda lay on her side, her breathing deep and rhythmic, her face relaxed in the vulnerability of sleep. She trusted the man beside her completely. That trust killed her. Herbert rose from the bed with careful precision, his movements practiced and controlled. He retrieved the hammer he'd hidden earlier, a heavy claw hammer purchased weeks before under the pretense of doing repairs around the flat. The weight of it felt comfortable in his hand, familiar somehow, as though he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life without consciously acknowledging it. What happened next transformed that bedroom into a butcher shop. Herbert struck Brenda's head with savage force, the hammer crushing through skull and into the soft tissue of her brain. The first blow likely killed her instantly, but Herbert didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He rained blows down upon her with mechanical efficiency, each impact producing sounds that would haunt the detectives who later tried to reconstruct the crime. Wet cracks of breaking bone, the dull thud of metal meeting pulverized flesh. When Herbert finally stopped, his breathing labored not from exertion but from something that might have been excitement. Brenda Parkin no longer had a recognizable face. The pillow beneath her had become a sopping crimson sponge, and blood had sprayed across the wall in arterial patterns that looked almost artistic in their horror. Herbert stood over his handiwork, hammer still gripped in his reddened hand, and felt nothing. No remorse, no horror at what he'd done, just a cold satisfaction that the task was complete. He cleaned himself methodically, washing blood from his hands and face with the same detached efficiency he'd shown during the murder itself. He changed his clothes, packed his few belongings into a worn suitcase, and walked out of Brenda Parkin's flat as though leaving for work on an ordinary morning. He even nodded pleasantly to a neighbor in the hallway, his face betraying nothing of the carnage he'd left behind in Brenda's bedroom. Brenda's body wasn't discovered for 3 days, by which time Herbert had already established himself in a new neighborhood, in a new pub, scanning the crowd for his next victim with the patient hunger of a predator who had just confirmed his terrible purpose. The monster had fed, and the feeding had only intensified his appetite for more. The discovery of Brenda Parkin's body shocked her small community. Neighbors who had seen her just days before, alive and apparently content, struggled to process the brutality visited upon her. The crime scene was so savage that the responding officers, men who had witnessed plenty of death during the war years, found themselves shaken by the sheer fury of the attack. One detective later described it as overkill to a degree that suggested rage beyond comprehension. Though in truth Herbert's violence stemmed not from rage but from something far more chilling: absolute indifference to human suffering. The investigation moved slowly. This was 1953, decades before DNA analysis or sophisticated forensic techniques would revolutionize criminal investigations. Detectives had fingerprints, witness statements, and their own instincts to work with. They interviewed neighbors extensively, trying to build a picture of Brenda's life in those final months. Multiple people mentioned the man she'd been seeing. Pleasant fellow, someone said, very polite, always smiled when passing in the hall. But Philip Herbert had vanished as completely as morning fog under sunlight. He'd given Brenda a false surname, claiming to be Philip Davidson from Manchester. The address he'd provided when asking about work in the area led to an abandoned warehouse. He'd paid cash for everything, left no paper trail, no photographs, no evidence beyond the testimonies of people who'd seen him but couldn't provide details specific enough to generate a useful description. Brown hair, or was it dark blonde? Average height, or perhaps slightly shorter? The witnesses contradicted each other on every point except one. He'd seemed so very ordinary, so forgettable. The case eventually went cold, filed away with other unsolved murders that accumulated in police archives like sedimentary layers of human tragedy. Detectives moved on to fresh horrors, fresh victims who demanded their attention. Brenda Parkin became another name in a ledger, another family grieving without closure, another killer who'd gotten away with murder. Philip Herbert, meanwhile, had already begun hunting again. His next confirmed victim was Margaret Spink, a 42-year-old widow living in Leeds, approximately 90 miles from where Brenda Parkin had been bludgeoned to death. Herbert had refined his approach slightly, learning from his first kill. He waited longer this time before moving in with Margaret. 6 months of careful courtship, of building trust and dependency, of making himself indispensable to her daily existence. Margaret's husband had died in an industrial accident, crushed by machinery that should have been maintained better, leaving her with a small insurance payout and a grief that never fully healed. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers nimble with needle and thread, her apartment filled with bolts of fabric and half-finished dresses hanging like ghosts from a clothing rack in the corner. She was lonely in the way that only those who've known deep companionship can be, achingly aware of the absence, the empty space where another person should exist. Herbert presented himself as John Ferguson this time, claiming to be a merchant seaman between voyages. The lie gave him flexibility, explaining why he sometimes disappeared for days at a time. He was allegedly checking in with shipping companies, he told Margaret, looking for his next assignment. In reality, he was simply maintaining distance, keeping multiple women on his carefully managed rotation, never staying in one place long enough to arouse suspicion or form genuine connections. Margaret fell deeply for the man she knew as John. She mended his clothes, cooked his favorite meals, listened to his fabricated stories about life at sea with genuine fascination. She told her sister that she was thinking of marriage, that John had hinted at settling down permanently, giving up the seafaring life to build something stable with her. Her sister, cautious and protective, suggested Margaret wait a bit longer, get to know this man better before making such permanent plans. Margaret laughed off these concerns with the confidence of someone who believed she'd finally found happiness after years of sorrow. On a rainy April night in 1954, Margaret invited Herbert to stay over, not for the first time, but on this particular evening, Herbert had decided it would be the last. He'd grown bored with the pretense, tired of her affections and expectations. More than that, he'd found his next target, a younger woman in Manchester who'd caught his attention at a dance hall the previous weekend. Margaret had served her purpose. Now she was simply an obstacle to be removed. The murder followed the same template as Brenda Parkin's death, with minor variations. Herbert waited until Margaret had fallen asleep, her body warm and trusting beside his own. He'd hidden his weapon earlier, another hammer, this one stolen from a construction site, wrapped in newspaper and tucked inside his suitcase. He retrieved it with the calm deliberation of a craftsman selecting the proper tool for a specific job. Margaret Spink died in her sleep, though died feels like an inadequate word for what Herbert inflicted upon her. He struck her head repeatedly with the hammer, each blow delivered with methodical precision. The rain outside masked any sounds that might have alerted neighbors. The wet crack of splitting bone, the hammer striking the wooden headboard when it missed its target, Herbert's own breathing growing faster as he worked. This time, Herbert experimented slightly with his method. After ensuring Margaret was dead, he used the claw end of the hammer to mutilate her face further, as though testing the limits of destruction he could inflict upon human flesh. He gouged and tore, transforming Margaret's features into an unrecognizable mess of torn skin and shattered bone. When he finally stopped, his arms aching from the effort, Margaret's head looked less like something human and more like meat someone had put through a grinder. Herbert cleaned up meticulously, spending nearly an hour wiping blood spatters from walls and floor, washing himself thoroughly in Margaret's bathroom. He packed his belongings and left before dawn, walking through rain-slicked streets toward the train station. He caught the early morning train to Manchester, his suitcase containing everything he owned. A few changes of clothes, some stolen money, and a hammer still bearing traces of Margaret Spink's blood and hair in the crevices where the metal met the wooden handle. Margaret's body was discovered by her sister, who'd come by after Margaret failed to meet her for their regular Sunday afternoon tea. The sister's screams brought neighbors running, and within hours, police were processing another impossibly brutal crime scene. The similarities to Brenda Parkin's murder were noted, but without concrete evidence linking the crimes, detectives couldn't definitively say they were looking for a single killer. It seemed impossible that someone could commit such savage acts and then simply disappear into the general population, walking among ordinary people without anyone sensing the monster beneath the skin. But that was precisely what Philip Herbert did best. He became unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of person who occupied space without making an impression. Between murders, he worked odd jobs, lived in boarding houses, frequented pubs where he was just another face among many. He occasionally sent postcards to women he was cultivating, signing them with whatever name he was currently using, maintaining the fiction of his various fabricated identities. What drove Herbert during those intervals between killings remains a matter of speculation. He never expressed remorse or explained his motivations in any meaningful way. Some psychologists who later studied his case suggested he killed not from sexual gratification. There was no evidence of sexual assault in any of his crimes, but from a deeper, more disturbing compulsion. Herbert seemed to kill for the sake of killing itself, finding satisfaction in the act of extinguishing life, of wielding absolute power over another human being in their most vulnerable moment. The intervals between his murders were irregular, suggesting he killed based on opportunity rather than adhering to any specific cycle or pattern. After Margaret Spink, he disappeared for nearly 2 years, during which time he may have committed other murders that were never connected to him, or he may have simply been biding his time, searching for the right victim under the right circumstances. What is certain is that by 1956, Philip Herbert was actively hunting again, moving through England's industrial cities like a malignant ghost, leaving no trail except the broken bodies of women who'd made the fatal mistake of trusting him. His confidence had grown with each successful murder. He'd learned that authorities were far less coordinated than one might assume, that information sharing between different police jurisdictions was haphazard at best, that he could move between cities and reinvent himself completely with minimal effort. His third confirmed victim would prove to be his undoing, though not immediately, and not in any way that suggested justice worked swiftly or efficiently. Before Herbert was finally caught, one more woman would die screaming in the darkness, her trust repaid with hammer blows and unimaginable pain. The monster was far from finished with his terrible work. Annie Cook was 53 years old when she met the man calling himself Thomas Benson at a working men's club in Nottinghamshire. Unlike Herbert's previous victims, Annie was not a widow. She was divorced, a distinction that carried social stigma in 1950s England. Her husband had left her for a younger woman after 20 years of marriage, and Annie carried the shame of that abandonment like a physical weight. She worked as a cleaning woman in office buildings, scrubbing floors and emptying bins while the rest of the world slept, invisible labor performed by invisible people. Herbert sensed her vulnerability immediately, that particular kind of wounded desperation that made women like Annie perfect targets. He approached her with his practiced charm, buying her drinks, expressing outrage at how her husband had treated her, assuring her that any man who couldn't see her worth was a fool. Annie hadn't been courted in decades. Herbert's attention felt like sunlight after years of darkness. She believed every word from his lying mouth. Their relationship progressed quickly, perhaps too quickly, but Annie wasn't about to question this unexpected gift of companionship. Within 3 months, Herbert had moved into her small terraced house, contributing what he claimed was his share of expenses while actually living off money stolen from previous victims and whatever he could pilfer from the odd jobs he occasionally worked. Annie introduced him to her neighbors as her fiancé, speaking the word with pride that made Herbert's deception all the more monstrous. But Herbert was already growing restless. Annie was needy in ways his previous victims hadn't been, constantly seeking reassurance of his affection, talking incessantly about their future together, making plans that grated against Herbert's fundamental inability to form genuine human connections. He'd decided Annie needed to die within weeks of moving in with her. The only question was timing. On November 3rd, 1956, Herbert made his move. The murder followed his established pattern. Waiting until Annie had fallen asleep, retrieving the hammer he'd hidden in their shared closet, approaching the bed with the cold resolve of an executioner. Annie stirred slightly as Herbert loomed over her, her eyes fluttering open for just a fraction of a second. In that terrible moment, she saw the hammer raised above her head, saw the man she loved transformed into something inhuman, and she understood with horrifying clarity that she was about to die. She tried to scream, but Herbert's first blow crushed her skull before sound could escape her throat. He struck her again and again, his movements mechanical and efficient, the hammer rising and falling with the rhythm of a machine designed for single purpose. Blood sprayed across the wallpaper, across Herbert's face and chest, across the bedsheets that Annie had carefully laundered just days before. Herbert obliterated Annie Cook's face with systematic thoroughness, each blow ensuring that she would be unrecognizable even to people who'd known her for years. When he finally stopped, his breathing heavy in the sudden silence of the bedroom, Herbert realized he'd made a critical error. In his fury to silence Annie's attempted scream, he'd struck harder and more frantically than usual, and the noise had been substantial. The hammer hitting the headboard multiple times, the bed frame shaking against the wall, sounds that might have penetrated the thin walls of the terraced house. Herbert froze, listening intently for any indication that neighbors had heard. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness, but no concerned voices called out. No footsteps approached the door. The house remained silent except for the steady drip of blood hitting the floor, a metronome measuring the end of Annie Cook's existence. Herbert cleaned himself quickly, his usual methodical approach rushed by anxiety. He packed his belongings, wiping surfaces for fingerprints with a dish towel, trying to eliminate evidence of his presence. But in his haste, he made mistakes, small errors that would eventually doom him. He left behind a shirt with Annie's blood soaked into the collar, kicked partially under the bed where he didn't notice it. He tracked bloody footprints down the hallway, partial prints that would later be matched to boots he was still wearing weeks after the murder. Most critically, Herbert had been seen. Annie's next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Davies, had noticed the man Annie called Thomas quite frequently. She'd struck up conversations with him while they both hung laundry in their adjacent yards, and she'd paid more attention than Herbert realized. When police later showed her photographs during the identification process, Mrs. Davies picked out Philip Herbert without hesitation, describing details about his appearance and mannerisms that contradicted the vague descriptions previous witnesses had provided. Annie's body was discovered the following morning by a coworker who'd come to check on her after Annie failed to show up for their shift. The crime scene was immediately recognized as bearing similarities to the unsolved murders of Brenda Parkin and Margaret Spink. A detective who'd worked the Parkin case happened to be consulting on the Cook investigation and noted the identical methodology. Victims bludgeoned to death in their beds by someone they trusted enough to share their sleeping space, faces destroyed with savage thoroughness, killers who disappeared without a trace. For the first time, authorities began seriously considering that they were dealing with a serial killer, a man who preyed on lonely women with calculated precision. The press picked up the story, and suddenly the isolated murders became a sensation. Headlines screamed about the bedroom butcher and the hammer killer, creating public panic and pressure on police to solve the crimes. This attention proved to be Herbert's undoing. As newspapers published what few details they had about the suspect, people began calling in tips. A landlady in Leeds remembered a tenant named John Ferguson who'd left suddenly around the time Margaret Spink was murdered. A pub owner in Birmingham recalled a man matching Herbert's description who'd been friendly with Brenda Parkin. Slowly, painstakingly, detectives began connecting the dots, building a composite picture of a man who used multiple names and identities but shared consistent physical characteristics and behavioral patterns. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a woman named Patricia Hale who contacted police after reading about the murders. Patricia had nearly become Herbert's fourth victim. She'd been courted by a man calling himself Richard Walker, who displayed all the warning signs Patricia only recognized in hindsight. He'd been charming but emotionally distant, generous but strangely controlling, affectionate but somehow hollow. Patricia had grown uncomfortable with the relationship and ended it abruptly, asking Richard to leave her home and never return. He complied without argument, simply packing his things and disappearing, but something about his expression as he'd left, a cold assessment that made her feel like prey that had narrowly escaped, had haunted her ever since. When Patricia saw the police sketches based on Mrs. Davies's description, she recognized her former suitor immediately. She provided a physical description more detailed than any witness had managed before, including a distinctive scar on Herbert's left forearm and the fact that he favored his right leg slightly when walking, evidence of an old injury. More importantly, Patricia remembered the name of a factory where Richard had mentioned working briefly, a genuine detail among his many fabrications. Police tracked the employment records and discovered that a Philip Herbert had worked at that factory during the time frame Patricia indicated. They obtained his army records, which included photographs and fingerprints. The face staring back at them from those military ID photos was the same face Mrs. Davies had described, the same man Patricia Hale had nearly allowed into her most vulnerable space. A nationwide manhunt began. Herbert's photograph appeared in newspapers across England, his various known aliases listed beneath his real name. Tips flooded in from all corners of the country. Herbert had been seen in Manchester, in Liverpool, in London, in a dozen places simultaneously according to panicked citizens who saw danger in every unremarkable middle-aged man. The actual Philip Herbert was in Blackpool, working under yet another false name at a seaside hotel, washing dishes and sleeping in a tiny room that smelled of mildew and old cigarettes. He'd been careful since Annie Cook's murder, avoiding any romantic entanglements, keeping his head down, moving from place to place every few weeks. But he'd grown complacent about checking newspapers, confident that his pattern of changing identities would protect him indefinitely. On a cold January morning in 1957, 2 police constables entered the hotel kitchen where Herbert was scrubbing pots. They asked him to step outside for a moment, their manner casual and unthreatening. Herbert complied, wiping his hands on his apron, still wearing the mask of normalcy that had served him so well for so long. He even smiled at the officers, that bland, forgettable smile that had disarmed so many women before him. "Are you Philip Herbert?" one of the constables asked, though they already knew the answer. They'd been studying his photograph for weeks, had memorized every feature of that unremarkable face. For just a moment, Herbert's mask slipped. Something cold and inhuman flickered behind his eyes, a glimpse of the monster that had bludgeoned 3 women to death in their beds. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by confusion that might have been convincing to someone who didn't know what he was. "I think you've made a mistake, officers," Herbert said calmly. "My name is George Patterson." But his hands were shaking slightly as he said it, betraying the fear that his rational mind refused to acknowledge. The constables placed him under arrest, and Philip Herbert's reign of terror finally came to an end, not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with quiet resignation in a Blackpool hotel kitchen that smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial soap. Philip Herbert's trial began in the summer of 1957 at the Leeds Assizes, and from the moment he entered the courtroom, observers were struck by his absolute ordinariness. This was the man who'd crushed 3 women's skulls with a hammer, who'd transformed bedrooms into abattoirs, who'd slept peacefully beside his victims before murdering them in the darkness. Yet he looked like someone's accountant, like a clerk or shopkeeper, like a man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting evidence that painted a picture of calculated brutality. Mrs. Davies identified Herbert as the man she'd known as Thomas Benson, Annie Cook's supposed fiancé. Patricia Hale testified about her relationship with Richard Walker, describing the cold emptiness she'd sensed beneath his practiced charm. Forensic experts presented the bloody shirt found under Annie's bed, demonstrating how blood spatter patterns proved Herbert had been standing directly over Annie when he struck the fatal blows. Most damning of all was the hammer itself. Police had found it during a search of Herbert's belongings at the Blackpool Hotel, wrapped in newspaper and hidden inside his suitcase. Microscopic analysis revealed traces of blood and hair from all 3 victims embedded in the crevices where the hammerhead met the wooden handle. Herbert had cleaned the weapon after each murder, but not thoroughly enough. The evidence of his crimes had traveled with him, hidden in plain sight, a talisman of death he couldn't bring himself to discard. Throughout the trial, Herbert remained eerily calm, showing no visible emotion as witnesses described his crimes in graphic detail. When prosecutors displayed photographs of the crime scenes, images so disturbing that several jurors looked away, Herbert studied them with detached curiosity, as though examining artwork in a gallery rather than evidence of his own monstrous actions. This lack of reaction disturbed everyone in the courtroom more than theatrical displays of remorse would have. Herbert's indifference to human suffering was absolute and undeniable. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, suggesting that Herbert must have been insane to commit such brutal murders. A psychiatrist testified that Herbert displayed characteristics of severe personality disorder, that his inability to form genuine emotional connections and his lack of empathy indicated fundamental psychological damage. But Herbert himself undermined this defense during his own testimony, speaking clearly and rationally about his actions, demonstrating through his very coherence that he'd known exactly what he was doing when he murdered those women. "Did you understand that what you were doing was wrong?" the prosecutor asked Herbert during cross-examination. Herbert considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I understood that it was illegal," he said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. "Whether it was wrong is a matter of perspective." The courtroom erupted at this statement, spectators shouting in outrage while the judge called for order. Herbert seemed genuinely confused by the reaction, as though he'd stated something self-evident rather than revealing the depth of his moral bankruptcy. When pressed to explain why he'd killed Brenda Parkin, Margaret Spink, and Annie Cook, Herbert offered answers that satisfied no one. He claimed he'd killed Brenda because she'd become tiresome with her expectations of commitment. He'd murdered Margaret because he'd grown bored with her company. Annie had died because she was overly emotional, and he'd had enough of dealing with her neediness. His reasons were mundane to the point of horror. He'd ended 3 lives for reasons no more substantial than someone might give for changing jobs or moving to a new city. "Did you feel anything when you killed them?" the prosecutor asked, trying to find some crack in Herbert's emotionless facade. "Any regret? Any horror at what you were doing?" Herbert thought about this carefully before responding. "No," he said simply. "I felt nothing at all." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. The judge, his voice heavy with disgust, sentenced Herbert to death by hanging, the standard punishment for murder in 1950s Britain. Herbert received the sentence without visible reaction, simply nodding as though the judge had informed him of a train schedule rather than his impending execution. As Herbert was led from the courtroom, he passed close to the families of his victims: Brenda's sister, Margaret's brother, Annie's daughter from her first marriage. They stared at him with hatred and grief so raw it seemed to fill the air with electricity. Herbert glanced at them briefly, his expression completely blank, before disappearing through the door that led back to the cells. Even in that final moment, he couldn't summon the humanity to acknowledge the pain he'd inflicted. The execution was scheduled for October 17th, 1957, at Armley Jail in Leeds. The 4 months Herbert spent in the condemned cell revealed nothing new about his psychology or motivations. He refused to meet with chaplains or psychiatrists, spending his days reading newspapers and novels with apparent contentment. He ate well, slept soundly, and showed no signs of the existential terror that usually consumed condemned prisoners in their final weeks. The night before his execution, Herbert wrote a brief statement that prison officials later made public. It read simply, "I regret that I was caught. I do not regret what I did. The women I killed were weak and pathetic creatures who threw themselves at me seeking something I could never provide. I ended their miserable existences efficiently and without unnecessary cruelty. I would do the same again if given the opportunity." This statement, devoid of remorse or recognition of wrongdoing, confirmed what everyone had already suspected. Philip Herbert was fundamentally incapable of empathy, a human being in shape only, empty of the emotional connections that make us truly human. Some called him a monster, but monsters are creatures of fiction. Herbert was something more terrifying, an ordinary man whose interior landscape was an absolute wasteland, devoid of the moral compass that guides most of humanity away from unthinkable acts. On the morning of October 17th, executioner Albert Pierrepoint entered Herbert's cell to prepare him for the gallows. Pierrepoint, who would eventually execute over 400 people during his career, later described Herbert as the most disturbing condemned man I ever encountered. Not because he was violent or difficult, but because he was so utterly calm, so completely unbothered by what was about to happen to him. Herbert walked to the gallows without resistance, his steps steady, his expression neutral. The hood was placed over his head, the noose positioned around his neck. Pierrepoint asked if Herbert had any final words. From beneath the hood, Herbert's voice came clear and emotionless. "This changes nothing. There are others like me. There will always be others like me." Then the trapdoor opened, and Philip Herbert dropped through it, his neck breaking instantly with the mechanical efficiency he'd once applied to murdering defenseless women. His body swung briefly before going still, the monster finally silenced forever. The execution of Philip Herbert brought closure to the families of his victims, but it couldn't erase the horror of what he'd done or answer the questions that haunted everyone who'd encountered his crimes. How could someone function so normally in society while harboring such lethal indifference to human life? How many women had he approached who'd been lucky enough to sense something wrong and pull away before it was too late? Were there other victims whose deaths had been attributed to other causes? Women who died at Herbert's hands without anyone ever knowing they'd been murdered? Detectives who worked the case spent years following up on unsolved murders of women in cities where Herbert was known to have lived or worked. Several cold cases showed similarities to his established pattern. Women found dead in their beds, blunt force trauma to the head, relationships with men who disappeared without a trace. But without concrete evidence, these deaths remained unsolved, question marks in the ledger of Herbert's potential victims. Patricia Hale, the woman who'd nearly become Herbert's fourth victim, lived with the knowledge that she'd escaped death by the narrowest of margins. In interviews conducted years after the trial, she described the psychological weight of that realization, how she'd replayed every interaction with the man she'd known as Richard Walker, searching for signs she'd missed, moments when she might have seen the monster behind the mask. She'd broken up with him because something had felt wrong, an instinct she couldn't articulate but had been wise enough to trust. That instinct had saved her life. The case of Philip Herbert remains one of Britain's most disturbing serial murder cases. Not because of the body count. Tragically, other killers have claimed far more victims, but because of what it revealed about the nature of predatory violence. Herbert didn't kill in the heat of passion or during commission of other crimes. He killed because he could, because the women who trusted him were vulnerable, and because he felt absolutely nothing when he extinguished their lives. Criminologists who later studied Herbert's case noted that he represented an early example of what would later be termed an organized serial killer. Someone who plans meticulously, maintains control during the crimes, and takes deliberate steps to avoid detection. His use of multiple identities, his careful selection of isolated victims, and his ability to blend seamlessly into different communities demonstrated a chilling level of sophistication in his predatory behavior. The women Herbert murdered were not random victims plucked from dark alleyways. They were women who'd invited him into their homes, their beds, their lives. They'd cooked meals for him, mended his clothes, planned futures that would never exist. This betrayal of intimacy made Herbert's crimes particularly horrifying. He weaponized the human need for connection, using women's loneliness and desire for companionship as the very mechanism of their destruction. In the decades since Herbert's execution, his crimes have been studied in criminology courses and referenced in countless discussions about the psychology of serial killers. But all the academic analysis in the world cannot truly explain what existed, or more accurately, what didn't exist, in Philip Herbert's interior world. Where most people have empathy, conscience, and emotional connection to others, Herbert had only empty space and calculating self-interest. The hammer he used to kill 3 women, the weapon that traveled with him from city to city, from victim to victim, now sits in a police museum archive, a rusted artifact of unspeakable violence. Occasionally, students of criminal justice are allowed to examine it under controlled conditions, studying the weight and balance of the tool Herbert transformed into an instrument of death. They hold it carefully, as though the evil it was used for might somehow still cling to the metal and wood, might contaminate anyone who touches it. But the hammer itself was never evil. It was simply a tool, no different from thousands of others manufactured for legitimate purposes. The evil existed entirely in Philip Herbert, in the emptiness where his humanity should have resided. The hammer was merely an extension of that void, a physical manifestation of his absolute indifference to human suffering. The surviving families of Brenda Parkin, Margaret Spink, and Annie Cook carried their grief for the rest of their lives. Brenda's sister never entered another romantic relationship, unable to trust that anyone was truly who they claimed to be. Margaret's brother became an advocate for victims' rights, channeling his pain into legislative efforts to improve how police investigated violent crimes against women. Annie's daughter struggled with addiction for years, self-medicating the trauma of losing her mother in such a horrific way, before eventually finding recovery and becoming a counselor for other trauma survivors. These ripples of violence extended far beyond the immediate victims, touching dozens of lives in ways both obvious and subtle. Neighbors who'd lived near Herbert's victims reported feeling unsafe in their own homes for years afterward, unable to shake the knowledge that evil had existed so close to them without their awareness. The detectives who worked the cases retired haunted by the crime scene photographs, by the faces they'd seen obliterated by hammer blows, by the knowledge that they'd been hunting Herbert for years without success while he continued killing. Even Albert Pierrepoint, the executioner who'd ended hundreds of lives with professional detachment, found Herbert's case uniquely disturbing. In his autobiography published decades later, Pierrepoint wrote, "I never believed in the concept of evil personified until I met Philip Herbert. He looked you in the eye and you saw nothing looking back. No soul, no conscience, just a calculating machine in human form. When I pulled that lever and sent him through the trapdoor, I felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice served. I felt only relief that something inhuman had been removed from the world." The question of whether Herbert's execution served any purpose beyond removing a dangerous predator from society remains debated. Britain would eventually abolish capital punishment in 1965, less than a decade after Herbert's death, as part of a broader evolution in thinking about justice and punishment. But in 1957, in the aftermath of Herbert's brutal crimes, public opinion overwhelmingly supported his execution. The families of his victims attended the execution, standing outside Armley Jail as the hour of Herbert's death approached, seeking whatever closure witnessing his end might provide. Did it help them? Brenda's sister said later that watching Herbert die, or rather, standing outside the prison knowing he was dying, brought no peace, no sense of her sister's death being avenged. "He destroyed Brenda's face so thoroughly that we couldn't have an open casket funeral," she told a reporter years later. "We couldn't see her one last time, couldn't say goodbye to the woman we loved. His death didn't change that. It didn't bring her back. It just meant one less monster was walking around pretending to be human." In the end, perhaps that's the most disturbing legacy of Philip Herbert, the reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. They don't always look dangerous or act suspiciously. Sometimes they look like everyone else, smile when they should, say the right things at the right moments, and hide their emptiness behind a mask of normalcy, so convincing that even the people closest to them never suspect what's missing inside. Herbert's final words, "There are others like me. There will always be others like me," proved prophetically accurate. In the decades since his execution, Britain and the world have seen countless other killers who fit his psychological profile. Ted Bundy, whose charm allowed him to lure dozens of women to their deaths. Dennis Nilsen, who murdered vulnerable young men in his London flat. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer who maintained a normal family life while torturing and killing strangers. The names change, the specifics vary, but the fundamental emptiness at their core remains constant. The Herbert case also highlighted how vulnerable certain populations are to predatory violence. All three of his confirmed victims were middle-aged women living alone, women that society in the 1950s viewed as past their prime, desperate for male attention, easy to manipulate. Herbert selected them deliberately, understanding that their isolation and loneliness made them less likely to question his lies, more willing to overlook inconsistencies in his stories, more vulnerable to his particular brand of manipulation. This targeting of vulnerable women remains a pattern in serial murder cases even today. The victims are often sex workers, drug addicts, runaways, homeless individuals, people existing on society's margins, whose disappearances may not be immediately noticed or investigated with the same vigor as more prominent citizens. Herbert's victims weren't quite that marginalized, but they occupied a similar social space. Women whose value society had deemed diminished, whose needs for companionship made them susceptible to exploitation by those who recognized their vulnerability. The investigation of Herbert's crimes also revealed significant problems with how different police jurisdictions shared information in the 1950s. The murders occurred in different cities, investigated by different police departments that rarely communicated with each other. If information had been centralized earlier, if the similarities between Brenda Parkins and Margaret Spink's murders had been recognized sooner, Annie Cook might have been saved. This realization led to reforms in how British law enforcement handled serial crime investigations, establishing better systems for sharing information across jurisdictional boundaries. Today, the house where Annie Cook died has been demolished, replaced by a modern housing development where young families live unaware of the horror that once occurred on that spot. Brenda Parkins' flat was converted into commercial space decades ago, the bedroom where she was murdered now part of an accounting office. Margaret Spink's apartment building still stands, though the current residents have no idea that one of Britain's most notorious serial killers once lived within those walls, once walked those hallways carrying a hammer wrapped in newspaper. This erasure of physical evidence, this overwriting of horror with ordinary life, is perhaps inevitable. The world moves on. New people occupy the spaces where terrible things happened, and they deserve to live without the weight of history crushing down on them. But something important is lost when we forget completely, when the victims become nothing more than names in old case files, when the lessons their deaths should teach us fade from collective memory. Brenda Parkin was more than a murder victim. She was a woman who worked hard, who grieved the loss of her husband, who opened her heart to someone she thought might ease her loneliness. Margaret Spink was more than a statistic. She was a talented seamstress whose fingers created beautiful things, who laughed with her sister over tea, who deserved to grow old and find happiness. Annie Cook was more than the final entry in Philip Herbert's ledger of death. She was a survivor of divorce in an era when divorce marked you as damaged goods, a woman who worked night shifts so others could work in clean offices, who dared to believe she might find love again in middle age. These women mattered. Their lives had value beyond the manner of their deaths. Remembering them, honoring them, means acknowledging not just how they died but how they lived, the hopes they carried, the kindnesses they showed, the people they loved and who loved them. It means recognizing that Philip Herbert didn't just end 3 lives. He destroyed 3 worlds, each one complete and irreplaceable. The true horror of Herbert's crimes isn't found in the graphic details of the murders themselves, though those details are nightmarish enough. The real horror lies in his absolute reduction of complex, feeling, worthy human beings into mere obstacles to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. He treated women like disposable objects, things to be used for his purposes and discarded when no longer useful. This dehumanization, this fundamental inability to recognize the humanity in others, represents evil in its purest form. When the trapdoor opened beneath Philip Herbert's feet on that October morning in 1957, justice was served in the most final way possible under the laws of the time. But justice, however necessary, couldn't undo what Herbert had done. It couldn't restore the shattered skulls or repair the destroyed faces. Couldn't give back the years stolen from 3 women who deserved to live them. Couldn't heal the trauma inflicted on families who would never be whole again. What justice could do, what it did do, was remove a predator who'd proven he would kill again if given the opportunity. Herbert's final statement made clear that he felt no remorse, that he viewed his victims with contempt, that he would have continued murdering had he remained free. His execution prevented future crimes, saved unknown women from becoming his 4th, 5th, or 6th victims. Whether that justifies state-sanctioned killing is a question each society must answer for itself. Britain ultimately decided it didn't, abolishing capital punishment and joining most other Western democracies in rejecting execution as a tool of justice. But in 1957, in the immediate aftermath of Herbert's capture and conviction, when the details of his crimes were fresh and horrifying, when the families of his victims demanded the ultimate punishment, the gallows seemed not just appropriate but necessary. Philip Herbert's story is a reminder of humanity's darkest capacities, of the monsters that can hide behind ordinary faces. It's a chronicle of manipulation and betrayal, of trust weaponized and intimacy transformed into a killing ground. But it's also a story about the women who fell victim to that predator. Women who deserved better than the brutal ends they met, who should be remembered for their lives rather than their deaths, who remain worthy of our compassion and respect decades after Philip Herbert's hammer silenced them forever. The bedroom butcher is dead, his body long since turned to dust in an unmarked grave reserved for executed criminals. But the lessons of his crimes remain vitally important. That evil often wears an ordinary face, that isolation makes people vulnerable to predators, that trust must be given carefully even in our desperate need for connection, and that we must remain vigilant in protecting those whom society marginalizes or overlooks. Brenda Parkin, Margaret Spink, and Annie Cook deserve to live full lives, to find genuine love, to grow old surrounded by people who valued them. Philip Herbert stole those futures with calculated brutality, crushing their skulls and their dreams with equal indifference. We honor their memory not by dwelling on the horror of their final moments, but by acknowledging the full measure of their humanity, something Philip Herbert, in his emptiness, could never comprehend or destroy completely. Their lives mattered, their deaths mattered, and their stories, however painful to recount, must be told and remembered, lest we forget the price of complacency in the face of evil, or the value of the vulnerable lives that predators seek to extinguish. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Blood Countess of Moscow. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, aka Salty Chica. The screams that echoed through the birch forests outside Moscow weren't the wind. They were the death songs of young women whose flesh was being boiled alive by a noblewoman who bathed in their agony like perfume. Before the term serial killer entered our vocabulary, before criminal psychology mapped the darkness of the human mind, there existed monsters who wore silk and diamonds. They killed not in shadows, but in marble halls. They tortured not in secret, but with the full knowledge of those who turned deaf ears to suffering. In the heart of 18th century Russia, one woman transformed her estate into a slaughterhouse, her servants into prey, and her sadism into a legacy of horror that would make even the most hardened investigators recoil in disbelief. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova didn't just murder. She refined cruelty into an art form, turned human suffering into her daily entertainment, and for 6 blood-soaked years, she painted the walls of her Moscow mansion with the gore of over 100 innocent souls. This is not folklore. This is not exaggeration. This is the documented, verified account of Russia's most prolific female serial killer, a noblewoman whose appetite for carnage was only matched by the corruption that protected her. Every word you're about to hear is true. Every scream was real, and every death was more horrific than the last. The winter of 1730 brought Daria Nikolaevna Ivanova into a world of privilege, power, and absolute impunity. Born into the Russian nobility during the reign of Empress Anna, Daria inherited more than wealth. She inherited the unchecked authority to treat human beings as property, as playthings, as disposable objects existing solely for her pleasure or destruction. Her family name carried weight. Her bloodline opened doors. And from her earliest years, she learned a fundamental lesson that would later cost over 100 lives. In Imperial Russia, noble women didn't face consequences. Her childhood passed unremarkably through the gilded corridors of aristocratic Moscow. Tutors taught her French. Servants attended her every whim. The Orthodox Church blessed her path. At 25, she married Gleb Alexeyevich Saltykov, a wealthy landowner whose estate sprawled across the Moscow province. For a brief period, marriage seemed to domesticate whatever darkness lurked inside her. She bore 2 sons. She attended church services. She played the role of the dutiful noble wife with convincing precision. But then Gleb died. The year was 1755 and Daria Saltykova, Now a 26-year-old widow with complete control over vast estates and hundreds of serfs, discovered something intoxicating about absolute power without male oversight. Russian law granted widows full authority over their deceased husband's properties. No father controlled her anymore. No husband restrained her. No man stood between her impulses and their satisfaction. She owned approximately 600 serfs, human beings legally bound to her land, unable to leave, unable to seek protection elsewhere, completely and utterly at her mercy. And Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova had no mercy. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small cruelties, the kind that powerful people inflict when they realize no one will stop them. A servant girl dropped a dish. Daria ordered her stripped naked and beaten with birch rods until her back resembled raw meat. A young woman laundered a shirt improperly. Daria personally grabbed the hot iron and pressed it against the girl's face, holding it there while the flesh sizzled and the screams turned hoarse. A serf arrived late with her mistress's tea. Daria scalded her arms with the boiling liquid, then forced her to continue serving despite the blistering wounds. These weren't punishments. They were experiments. Daria was testing boundaries, measuring how much pain she could inflict, discovering how far she could push before someone intervened. The answer terrified everyone around her. There were no boundaries. No one would intervene. She could do anything. Her estate just outside Moscow became her laboratory of suffering. The main house, a sprawling mansion with multiple wings, servants' quarters, and vast grounds, provided perfect isolation. Screams carried only so far through thick walls and across snow-covered fields. The nearest neighbors were fellow nobles who understood the unspoken aristocratic code. What happened on someone else's estate was their business. The church preached that serfs should accept their suffering as God's will. Local authorities owed their positions to people exactly like Daria. Every institution that might have stopped her was either complicit or powerless. She began selecting victims with deliberate care. Young women, primarily, girls between 15 and 25 who possessed neither the strength to fight back effectively nor the connections to seek help. Pregnant serfs particularly attracted her attention, as if the presence of new life intensified her hunger to destroy it. She'd summon them to her private chambers on the slightest pretense. A missing button, a crooked hem, a speck of dust on furniture, bread baked insufficiently soft. The actual transgression never mattered. The summons itself was the death sentence. What happened next in those private rooms made seasoned investigators sick decades later when they finally documented the evidence. Daria didn't simply kill. She savored. She prolonged. She innovated. Her favorite method involved scalding water. She'd order servants to heat massive pots until the water reached boiling temperatures. Then she'd personally pour it over her victims' naked bodies. But she didn't kill them immediately. She'd start with the feet, watching the skin blister and peel, listening to the screams, observing how long consciousness lasted. Then the legs, then the torso. Sometimes she'd stop, let the victim's burns fester for days without treatment, then repeat the process. Some girls endured this torture for weeks before death finally released them. When boiling water grew monotonous, she experimented with fire. She'd tie young women to posts in her courtyard during brutal Russian winters, naked, and leave them overnight. By morning, they'd be frozen corpses, their skin blue-black, their final expressions locked in agonized rigor mortis. Other times she reversed the temperature torture, forcing servants into overheated bathhouses where temperatures exceeded human tolerance, literally cooking them alive in steam and heat until their organs failed. Beatings constituted her daily entertainment. Not quick, merciful beatings meant to punish and release, but methodical destructions of the human body. She used clubs, iron rods, firewood, whatever implement struck her fancy. She'd beat women's faces until their features became unrecognizable pulp. She'd beat their bodies until ribs cracked and internal bleeding painted their skin purple. She'd beat pregnant women's stomachs until they miscarried, then beat them more for losing the babies. And she'd continue beating long after they lost consciousness, long after they stopped responding, beating dead bodies with the same fury she'd shown living ones. Her hands did much of this work. This wasn't a noblewoman ordering executions from comfortable distance. Daria Saltykova personally participated in nearly every torture session. Servants later testified seeing her covered in blood, hair disheveled, eyes bright with excitement, breathing hard from exertion as she stood over broken bodies. She'd grab victims by their hair and smash their faces into walls repeatedly. She'd use her fingernails to scratch deep gouges into flesh. She'd kick fallen women with her expensive boots until their kidneys ruptured. The estate developed a grim rhythm. Serfs learned to recognize the signs. When Daria's mood darkened, when she called for certain servants, when she locked herself in particular rooms, they'd hear the screams starting raw, animal sounds of incomprehensible pain, then continuing for hours, sometimes days. The sounds would eventually stop, replaced by terrible silence. Then servants would receive orders to dispose of bodies, to dig graves in remote corners of the property, to burn bloodied clothing, to scrub rooms where walls had been splattered with evidence of unspeakable acts. And every single person on that estate knew. The other servants knew. The estate managers knew. The priests who visited knew. The merchants who delivered supplies knew. They all knew, and they all remained silent, because speaking meant becoming her next victim. By 1760, Daria Saltykova's bloodlust had evolved from sporadic violence into systematic slaughter. The killings that had once shocked her household staff became routine, expected, almost mundane in their regularity. Where she'd previously murdered one or two serfs monthly, now bodies piled up weekly. Her methods grew more elaborate, more theatrical, as if she'd grown bored with simple torture and needed greater stimulation to achieve the same satisfaction. She began hosting what can only be described as torture sessions, extended periods where she'd summon multiple victims simultaneously and torment them in rotating fashion, keeping herself entertained for entire days. She'd have young women lined up, naked and terrified. Then she'd move down the line methodically. First one would receive 20 lashes. Then the next would have boiling water poured on her feet. Then the third would be beaten with iron rods. Then she'd circle back to the first and escalate the torture. This could continue for 8, 10, 12 hours without pause, with Daria barely showing fatigue while her victims collapsed, one by one, into death. Hair pulling became one of her signature tortures. She'd grab handfuls of a victim's hair and yank with such force that chunks of scalp tore away, leaving bloody patches of exposed skull. She'd continue this systematic scalping until victims' heads were raw masses of torn tissue. Then she'd rub salt into the wounds, or pour vinegar, or apply hot irons to the exposed bone. The pain from these tortures was so extreme that women would bite through their own tongues, choke on their own vomit, or literally die from the shock before she'd finished. Strangulation fascinated her. Unlike quick hangings meant to break necks instantly, Daria preferred slow manual strangulation. She'd wrap her hands around a victim's throat and squeeze gradually, watching their eyes bulge, their faces turn purple, their bodies convulse. But she'd release pressure just before death, let them gasp and recover slightly, then squeeze again. She'd repeat this cycle dozens of times, bringing them to the edge of death and pulling them back, until finally she'd hold her grip and watch the life drain completely from their eyes. Some victims endured this torture for over an hour before death finally claimed them. Her creativity in inflicting suffering seemed boundless. She'd force women to kneel on sharp stones for entire days without movement, their knees shredding against the jagged surfaces until bone showed through. She'd tie victims' hair to ceiling beams and leave them suspended, their entire body weight pulling against their scalps, for days at a time. She'd break fingers individually with hammers, starting with the smallest digits and working toward the thumbs, taking hours to complete both hands. She'd use pliers to extract teeth one by one, then pour acid into the bleeding sockets. Winter murders carried particular horror. During Russia's brutal cold months, she'd discover how the human body responded to extreme temperature torture. She'd drag servants outside wearing only thin nightclothes, then drench them with freezing water. They'd freeze almost instantly, their clothing becoming ice armor, their exposed skin crystallizing. She'd leave them in courtyards, frozen alive, as decorations. Some remained conscious for terrifying lengths of time, unable to move or speak, watching frostbite blacken their extremities before shock mercifully rendered them unconscious. Their frozen corpses would remain on display for days before being hauled away and buried. She developed obsessions with specific body parts. Breasts particularly drew her sadistic attention. She'd burn them with hot coals, slice them with knives, beat them with wooden mallets until they were shapeless bags of ruptured tissue. Pregnant women's swollen bellies triggered even darker impulses. She'd kick them repeatedly, beat them with clubs specifically targeting the unborn child, seemingly enraged by the presence of life she couldn't immediately destroy. Multiple testimonies later confirmed she'd successfully induced miscarriages through beatings, then blamed the women for killing their babies and tortured them further as punishment. Faces held fascination for her. She'd study her victims' expressions during torture with clinical interest, seemingly cataloging different manifestations of agony. She'd burn faces with candles, watching skin bubble and melt. She'd smash faces against furniture corners repeatedly, pulverizing cheekbones and eye sockets. She'd use her fingernails to scratch deep furrows across foreheads and cheeks. Some victims who somehow survived her attentions were left so disfigured that other serfs could barely recognize them. The disposal of bodies became increasingly careless as her kill count rose. Initially, she'd ordered proper secret burials in remote estate locations. But as victims multiplied, corpses were simply dragged to outbuildings, dumped in wells, buried in shallow graves that animals would later disturb. The estate grounds developed areas that everyone avoided, places where the earth seemed perpetually stained dark, where dogs wouldn't venture, where certain smells lingered regardless of season. Her sons, now teenagers, witnessed their mother's transformation into a creature of pure malice. They'd grown up watching servants disappear, hearing screams, seeing bloodstains hastily cleaned from floors. The horror had become their normal. Later testimonies suggested they neither participated in nor reported their mother's crimes. They simply existed in parallel with the nightmare, perhaps too terrified or too corrupted to act. The serfs trapped on Saltikova's estate lived in constant terror. Every morning brought uncertainty. Would they survive the day? Young women especially understood they were marked prey. Some attempted escape despite knowing the legal impossibility. Russian law treated runaway serfs as criminals. Authorities would capture and return them to their owners. The few who tried fleeing Saltikova's estate were caught and brought back to face punishments that made death seem merciful. She'd torture would-be escapees with special viciousness, using them as examples to discourage others. These torture sessions lasted weeks, with victims kept barely alive through the ordeal, displayed to other serfs as warnings. Food became a weapon in her arsenal. She'd starve victims for days, then offer them meals, except the food would be contaminated, spoiled, or laced with substances that caused violent illness. She'd force women to eat while she beat them, so they'd associate sustenance with pain. She'd deprive them of water until dehydration caused delirium, then give them water mixed with vinegar or urine, laughing as they choked it down out of desperation. Sleep deprivation tortured victims for extended periods. She'd keep women awake for days through continuous beatings, loud noises, or forcing them to stand in uncomfortable positions. When hallucinations and psychosis set in from exhaustion, she'd mock their confused state, using their delirium as entertainment. Some victims' minds broke completely before their bodies gave out, leaving them as empty shells that couldn't even properly register pain anymore. By 1762, conservative estimates suggested she'd murdered at least 75 people, though the actual number was likely much higher. Many deaths went completely unrecorded. Serfs who died without witnesses, whose bodies were never found, whose disappearances were explained away as runaways. They vanished from history entirely. The documented victims represented only those whose deaths left sufficient evidence or testimony to later prove. And still, nobody stopped her. Local priests accepted her generous donations and ignored the evidence. Estate managers feared becoming victims themselves if they objected. Fellow nobles maintained the silence that protected their own abuses. The entire system conspired to enable her murders through collective indifference to serf suffering. But systems have breaking points. And Daria Saltykova, drunk on impunity and escalating bloodlust, was about to push too far. The beginning of Daria Saltykova's end arrived not through justice, but through desperation. Two serfs, broken by watching yet another murder they were powerless to prevent, made a decision that required unimaginable courage. They would report their mistress to the authorities. The victims whose deaths finally sparked action were a young married couple, Yefrosinia Aline and her husband. Yefrosinia worked directly in Saltykova's household, and like so many before her, became the target of her mistress's unpredictable rage. The exact trigger, if any existed beyond Saltykova's perpetual hunger for violence, remains unclear. What's documented is that Saltykova subjected Yefrosinia to days of continuous torture that pushed brutality to new extremes even by her horrific standards. She began with Yefrosinia's hair, that favorite torture target. She grabbed fistfuls and yanked until huge patches of scalp tore free, leaving Yefrosinia's head a bloody patchwork of exposed bone and hanging flesh. The young woman's screams echoed through the mansion for hours. But Saltykova was just beginning. She moved to burning. Hot irons pressed against Yefrosinia's body systematically. Breasts, stomach, back, thighs. The smell of cooking flesh permeated the rooms. Saltykova held each iron in place longer than previous sessions, studying how deeply she could char tissue before reaching vital organs. Yefrosinia's skin blackened and split, weeping fluids that pooled on the floor beneath her. When burning lost its novelty, Saltykova switched to beating. She used a heavy wooden log, the kind typically used for firewood. She struck Yefrosinia's body repeatedly, methodically breaking bones. Ribs cracked with audible snaps. Arms fractured, legs shattered. Each blow landed with Saltykova's full strength behind it, driven by fury that seemed to feed on itself rather than exhaust. But Yefrosinia wouldn't die. Her body clung stubbornly to life despite damage that should have killed her hours earlier. This appeared to enrage Saltykova further. She escalated to her most extreme measure yet. She ordered boiling water brought in massive quantities. Then, personally, methodically, she poured it over every inch of Yefrosinia's already brutalized body. The final assault lasted another 3 hours. When Yefrosinia finally died, Saltykova had spent nearly 4 full days torturing her without significant rest. The body was so damaged that witnesses later testified they could barely recognize it as human. Skin hung in strips. Bones protruded from torn flesh. Burns covered almost every surface. The face had been beaten into an unrecognizable mass. Yefrosinia's husband, Aline, watched his wife's murder unfold. The psychological torture of witnessing your spouse destroyed piece by piece, hearing her screams, being powerless to intervene, knowing you might be next. It shattered something inside him, but it also hardened his resolve. He decided that even if it cost his own life, he would report this horror to someone who might act. In July 1762, Aline and another serf named Savely Martyanov approached the central Moscow authorities. This act itself was nearly suicidal. Serfs had no legal standing to accuse nobles. The usual outcome of such accusations was punishment of the accuser for daring to impugn a noblewoman's honor. Aline and Martyanov knew this. They came forward anyway. The first officials they approached dismissed them immediately. A serf accusing a noblewoman? Impossible. Clearly they were lying, probably runaways inventing stories to excuse their desertion. The men were threatened with whipping and imprisonment if they didn't retract their accusations. They refused to retract. They approached other authorities. More dismissals, more threats. They persisted with stubborn desperation, moving up the chain of bureaucracy, being rejected at every level. For weeks they campaigned, risking their lives repeatedly, driven by the memory of Yefrosinia's screams and the knowledge that Saltykova continued murdering with impunity. Their persistence finally reached someone willing to listen, or more accurately, someone politically positioned to use their accusations. The complaint eventually landed before Empress Catherine II herself. Catherine, known as Catherine the Great, had recently seized power through a coup. She was consolidating her rule and needed to establish herself as an enlightened, just ruler concerned with law and order. A case involving a noble serial killer who'd murdered over 100 serfs presented a perfect opportunity to demonstrate that even the aristocracy answered to imperial justice. Catherine ordered a full investigation. The investigation, beginning in late 1762, slowly peeled back 6 years of systematic horror. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, surviving servants, former estate workers, neighbors who'd heard rumors, merchants who'd delivered supplies and noticed disturbing patterns. Every testimony revealed fresh atrocities. One servant described watching Saltykova tie a young woman's hair to a ceiling beam and leave her suspended for 2 days. The victim's entire scalp eventually tore free from her skull. She died from blood loss and shock, still hanging by her detached scalp. Another testified about winter murders where Saltykova would strip pregnant women naked, tie them to posts outside, and pour freezing water over them repeatedly until they froze solid. The investigator documented at least 7 pregnant victims killed this way. A coachman recalled delivering a young serf girl to the estate and returning weeks later to find her unrecognizable. Face destroyed, body covered in burns, unable to walk or speak, dying slowly from infected wounds that Saltykova refused to treat. The estate groundskeeper led investigators to multiple burial sites scattered across the property. They exhumed bodies, many showing clear signs of extreme violence even years after death. Broken bones, burn marks on skeletal remains, evidence of being buried alive in several cases. Church records proved damning. Local priests had recorded dozens of serf deaths on Saltykova's estate, far exceeding normal mortality rates. The pattern was impossible to deny, and many deaths had never been recorded at all. Saltykova had simply disappeared victims without bothering to report their passing. As evidence mounted, the investigation expanded to examine whether anyone had helped or enabled Saltykova. Several estate employees were arrested for assisting in tortures or concealing murders. But most were also victims in their own way, people forced to participate under threat of becoming targets themselves. The investigation revealed the systematic fear that had paralyzed everyone around Saltykova. The Russian Orthodox Church faced scrutiny for accepting Saltykova's donations while ignoring obvious signs of mass murder. Priests had visited her estate regularly, heard confessions, blessed her household, all while servants disappeared and screams echoed through the halls. Some had even helped explain away suspicious deaths. The church's complicity, while never officially acknowledged, became clear through investigation documents. Local authorities who dismissed earlier complaints faced questions about their negligence. Why hadn't they investigated when neighbors reported suspicious activities? Why had they threatened accusers rather than examining their claims? The answers revealed the depth of aristocratic privilege. Nobles protected each other because today's accused might be tomorrow's protector. The investigation took over 6 months. Saltykova remained under house arrest at her Moscow residence during this period, living comfortably while evidence of her crimes accumulated. She maintained innocence throughout, claiming all serf deaths resulted from natural causes, accidents, or justified punishments. She expressed outrage that anyone would believe serfs' testimony over her word. But the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators eventually documented 75 confirmed murders. Victims whose deaths could be proven beyond doubt through witness testimony, physical evidence, or church records. They suspected the true count exceeded 140, possibly reaching 150 or higher, but couldn't definitively prove these additional deaths. The murdered weren't just numbers. Each had been a young woman with hopes, fears, relationships. The investigation records preserved some of their names: Anna, Kionia, Lukeria, Mavra, Fedosia, and dozens more. Women who'd committed no crimes except existing within reach of a monster. In October 1768, 6 years after the investigation began, Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova finally faced judgment. The trial became a public spectacle, one of the first times in Russian history that the nobility watched one of their own prosecuted for crimes against serfs. Empress Catherine II made certain the proceedings received maximum attention, using the case to signal that her reign represented justice and enlightenment. The verdict shocked no one who'd followed the case. Guilty of murdering 75 people. Guilty of torture, cruelty, and systematic abuse. Guilty of crimes so extensive and horrific that they offended even hardened imperial judges accustomed to aristocratic excesses. But what punishment could possibly match such monstrous crimes? Russian law at the time didn't include capital punishment for noblewomen, regardless of their offenses. Even Catherine II, who wanted to make an example of Saltykova, couldn't legally execute her. Instead, the court crafted a sentence designed to maximize suffering and public humiliation, the two things that might approximate justice for a serial killer who'd tortured over 100 people to death. Saltykova would be chained publicly in Moscow for 1 hour, displayed as a criminal for common people to see and condemn. This represented extraordinary humiliation for a noblewoman, being exhibited like an animal, subjected to the stares and jeers of the lower classes she'd considered beneath contempt. For someone whose entire identity rested on aristocratic superiority, this public degradation cut deeper than physical punishment. Then she'd be imprisoned for life in complete isolation. But not prison as we might imagine. Saltykova would spend her remaining years in a specially constructed cell beneath a monastery, living underground in darkness and silence. The cell would contain no windows, no sunlight, no human contact except for guards delivering food through a slot. She'd exist in perpetual twilight, surrounded by stone walls, experiencing a living death that would continue for decades. The punishment was implemented exactly as decreed. In October 1768, Daria Saltykova was chained in a public square in Moscow. A sign hung around her neck identifying her crimes: murderess and torturer. Crowds gathered. Thousands of Muscovites came to see the noble killer displayed in chains. Many were family members or loved ones of her victims, finally witnessing something resembling accountability. Contemporary accounts describe people weeping, shouting accusations, throwing refuse at her. Saltykova reportedly maintained aristocratic composure throughout, refusing to show remorse or shame even while standing in chains before the masses she'd considered subhuman. After the hour ended, guards removed her to the Ivanovsky convent in Moscow. There, beneath the monastery buildings, workers had constructed her tomb, a cell measuring approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls, a tiny slot for food delivery, and one small lamp that provided minimal light. This would be her entire world until death. The isolation was nearly absolute. Guards delivered food but didn't speak to her. No visitors were permitted. No letters arrived or departed. No books, no conversation, no stimulation of any kind. Just endless silence, darkness, and the stone walls that enclosed her shrinking world. For someone who'd thrived on control, power, and the screams of her victims, this sensory deprivation represented its own form of torture. She lived in that cell for 33 years. Historical records document little about her imprisonment because that was the point. She was meant to vanish from society, to be forgotten while still breathing. But occasional reports filtered out through monastery workers. She didn't show remorse. She didn't confess sins or seek religious redemption, despite being held in a religious institution. She apparently spent years insisting she'd been wrongly convicted, that serfs had lied, that she was the victim of political persecution. Her sons, who'd inherited her estates after her conviction, visited occasionally during the early years. These visits stopped eventually. Whether they abandoned her out of shame, convenience, or their own psychological damage from growing up in her house of horrors remains unclear. She died alone, which seems grimly appropriate for someone who dealt in isolation and suffering. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova died in 1801 at approximately 71 years old, having spent nearly half her life imprisoned. She's buried somewhere in the monastery grounds, the exact location unmarked and forgotten. Unlike her victims, who disappeared into unmarked graves scattered across her estate, she at least received burial in consecrated ground, a final aristocratic privilege that survived even her conviction. Her case left strange echoes through Russian history. For decades, her name became synonymous with aristocratic cruelty. Peasants used Salty Chica, the nickname she acquired, as a boogeyman figure to frighten children. Writers referenced her in stories about noble corruption. Reformers cited her case when arguing for serf liberation. Yet the deeper implications went largely unexamined. Saltykova had murdered over 100 people across 6 years on an estate that dozens of witnesses visited regularly. Everyone knew. Priests knew. Officials knew. Neighbors knew. The entire social structure knew and enabled her through silence, complicity, and shared investment in maintaining aristocratic power. She was exceptional only in her scale and enthusiasm for violence, not in her belief that serfs existed for noble exploitation. The investigation had revealed other estates where suspicious numbers of serfs died under questionable circumstances. But only Saltykova faced prosecution. The rest continued as before, protected by the same aristocratic privilege that had shielded her until political circumstances made her prosecution useful to Catherine II's image building. Russian serfdom continued for another century after Saltykova's imprisonment. Millions remained trapped in a system that treated them as property, vulnerable to masters who could beat, starve, rape, or kill them with minimal legal consequence. Saltykova represented an extreme point on a spectrum of abuse, but the spectrum itself remained intact. The case raises uncomfortable questions about complicity and collective responsibility. At what point do bystanders who enable evil through inaction become as guilty as the perpetrator? The servants who helped dispose of bodies, were they victims or accomplices? The priests who accepted donations while ignoring murders, how culpable were they? The officials who dismissed early complaints, did their negligence make them partially responsible for subsequent deaths? Modern psychology would likely diagnose Saltykova with severe sadistic personality disorder, possibly psychopathy. She displayed classic signs: complete lack of empathy, inability to feel remorse, viewing others as objects for personal gratification, escalating need for stimulation, and pleasure derived specifically from causing suffering. But diagnosis doesn't explain origin. Was she born with these traits, or did absolute power corrupt her into monstrosity? We'll never know what Saltykova thought during those 33 years of isolation. Did she relive her crimes with satisfaction or horror? Did she understand what she'd become? Did the sensory deprivation and endless silence ever break through her psychological armor to reveal something resembling human conscience? The historical record provides no answers. She remained opaque to the end, a human cipher whose inner life generated incomprehensible evil. Her victims remain mostly anonymous. We know some names, but most disappeared from history as completely as they'd been erased from life. Young women who dreamed ordinary dreams. Marriage, children, freedom perhaps, whose lives were cut short in prolonged agony by a woman who found their suffering entertaining. They deserve remembrance beyond being mere statistics in a serial killer's count. The estate where most murders occurred no longer exists as it did then. Time has buried the evidence literally and figuratively, but the history remains, documented in investigation records, court proceedings, and witness testimonies preserved in Russian archives. The screams have faded. The blood has long since washed away. The shallow graves have been reclaimed by earth and time. But the story endures as a reminder of what humans become when power faces no constraints, when privilege insulates monsters from consequences, when systems value some lives as inherently less than others. Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova earned her place among history's worst serial killers not just through her body count, but through the pure, refined cruelty she inflicted on victims who had no escape, no protection, no hope. She proved that the capacity for evil isn't limited by gender, class, or education. It merely requires opportunity, power, and the absence of accountability. In her hands, privilege and impunity transformed into instruments of systematic torture and mass murder. Her legacy is written in blood, screams, and the suffering of over 100 souls who deserved justice that came too late, if at all. The Blood Countess of Moscow died in darkness, alone, forgotten by all except historians documenting humanity's capacity for cruelty. Perhaps that's the only fitting end for someone who spent 6 years transforming her estate into a slaughterhouse and her position into permission to destroy anyone unfortunate enough to fall within her reach. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.